6:31. Good evening, everyone. It is Thursday night, November 16th. You're here at the regular meeting of the Planning Commission, and I have a call to order. And let me see, who do I want to do the... I'm gonna ask our secretary to lead the flag salute. Come on, David, you've never done that. Awesome.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, everyone. Roll call.
Good evening. Commissioner Hoopengarner? Present. Commissioner Carvalero?
Here.
Commissioner Bass?
Here.
Commissioner Elchel?
Here.
Commissioner Guy?
Here.
Vice Chair Jones?
Here.
Chair Buckner?
I'm here. Thank you.
And we have a quorum.
Thank you. Do I have a motion for the approval of the agenda?
Vice Chair? Chair Guy?
That's only 6.
Thank you. And motion passes unanimous.
Thank you very much. Before we go to approving the minutes, I understand that our secretary has caught a few errors that he wants to make corrections.
Yeah, we have a couple corrections we'd like to make. I'll just go ahead and do, we have one on each item, so I'll just do both to save time. On October 19th, page 10 of 13, towards the bottom, we're just going to change to read under the Catch Restaurant. I'll just read it out to you. It should just read, Catch Restaurant has had 3 special events since June. 2 were approved by the City of West Hollywood and 1 was unapproved. Staff clarified all 3 would count towards their 4-event limit. The city has received 5 complaints from these events. They have only received violations for special events. And that was for October 19th. And then one for November 2nd. It's just clarifying under Section C of the action that it would, to correct all of the items identified.
Okay, with those corrections, do I have, we can move both of them at the same time if someone wants to make a motion. Approval.
And the minutes are approved unanimously.
Thank you. Next item is item number 6, which is public comment.
We have no public comment.
No public comment at this time. For those of you in our auditorium here who might want to have an opportunity at the end of our meeting to speak, you can take a speaker slip and have some time at the end of the meeting. Director's report.
Special time. It's a 4 p.m. meeting, so that's a special time. And then just to update, the City Council did approve the cannabis regulations that the Planning Commission saw earlier. One change that they did make was they did direct us to allow the authorization of 4 temporary use permits for the 4 existing medical marijuana dispensaries to apply for retail cannabis. So that way, if they do apply for it, then retail cannabis could possibly be available in January in West Hollywood at one of those 4 locations.
Would that mean that those 4 people would get those permits?
Not on a permit basis. It would just be a temporary use permit, and they would have to go through the same process just like everybody else to get a permanent license.
Okay, thank you. Next item is item 8, items from commissioners. Do you have anybody? Vice Chair, please.
Thank you. We have quite a few items ahead of us this evening, so I'm going to say this now. I am not going to be present for the November 30th meeting. I just want to say that for the record. I have to be out of town for business travel, so I will not be in attendance at the next meeting.
Thank you. Any other commissioners want to speak at this time? Then we'll move on to the consent calendar. There is none. And we have several public hearings tonight. The procedure is that we will have a staff report first, and then we will have opportunity for commissioners to ask questions of staff, and then the applicant or the applicant's representative will have an opportunity to address the commission, and 10 minutes at the beginning, and then we have, for those of you in public who want to speak on a particular item, please take a speaker slip, and we'll call on you to participate, and then we'll have rebuttal, and then opportunity to debate on it or discuss it, let's put it that way, the commissioners, and further questions that might come up. And then we'll possibly close the public hearing and have a motion. So let's begin. The first item is item 10A, 541 Norwich Drive, and we have a staff report.
Good evening, Chair Buckner and members of the Commission. The item before you this evening is a request to demolish a vacant 1,072 square foot single-family dwelling with a detached garage and to construct a 3,000 square foot two-story dwelling with a two-car tandem space on a 6,000 square foot lot. The projects involving a development of a single-family dwelling are generally not approved by, are generally approved administratively by staff. However, the project also includes a variance request to deviate from the front yard setback in order to provide consistency with the average front setbacks in the vicinity. A variance request is subject to Planning Commission approval, and therefore, in this instance, the entire project is before you for consideration. The site is located on the west side of Norwich Drive between Melrose Avenue to the north and Rosewood to the south. The relatively flat site is approximately 6,000 square feet in size and measures approximately 40 feet wide by 150 deep. The site and its surrounding residential properties are zoned R1B. The commercial properties to the north along Melrose are zoned CN2. The project is contemporary in design and uses the concept of wrapping surfaces interlocked with intruding forms. The wrapping surfaces are stepped away from the southerly property line and are also punched with openings. On the north elevation, on the north elevation, the open end of the wrap is enclosed with a vertical wood siding, windows, and a stone-clad chimney tying it all together. The ends of the siding, the ends of the structure are more open with considerable use of glazing and a deep recess to provide sufficient shading from early morning sun. The residential development standards require that front yard setbacks for new developments shall be the average of front yard setbacks of the two adjacent properties with a 15-foot minimum and a 30-foot maximum. In order to approve a variance, the Commission must determine that the property has unique circumstances that apply to the property involved, but do not generally apply to other properties in the vicinity. In this instance, the adjacent dwelling to the north maintains a front setback of 19 feet 9 inches, and the adjacent dwelling to the south maintains an irregular front yard setback of 76 feet. Due to the anomaly of the 76-foot setback, the average setback would be 47 feet 10 inches, exceeding the code's the 30-foot maximum allowed by code. The aggregated average front yard setback for all residential properties fronting the west side of Norwich is approximately 19 feet. The applicant's variance request is to provide a 20-foot setback and be more consistent with the front yard setbacks in the area. Given the circumstances, it's staff's assessment that the variance is warranted. Overall, the proposed project is well suited for the site. It's thoughtfully designed and complementary to the context of the neighborhood. With the variance to allow the 20-foot front yard setback, the project meets all the applicable development standards, including the West Hollywood West design guidelines. Therefore, staff recommends that the commission approve the project request, subject to the findings and conditions of approval set forth in the draft resolution. This concludes my presentation. The project architect and the property owners are in the audience if there's any questions for them as well. Thank you.
Do any commissioners have questions of staff at this point? No? I see no questions at this point. Would the applicant come forward? Do we have an applicant here? And when a speaker comes to the podium, please state your full name and your city of residence before you begin speaking.
Eric Hammerland and City of Los Angeles.
Would you like to address the commission or anything you want to tell us?
I think he covered pretty much everything. The most important thing is that our undue hardship is that the neighboring building to us is 76 feet back, which really hurts our average. And it's not congruent with the rest of the properties on the street.
Just a question, the property that has a 76-foot setback, is that an older residence? Is it a
Yes, it is.
residence?
It's, 30s, 20s? It's old.
It's been there
26.
for quite a while, long before we had our code.
Right.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? Okay, thank you. Do we have any speakers? We have one speaker. Okay. You'll have an opportunity to come back if you want to respond to what the speaker says.
We have Tom Fleming.
Tom Fleming from the audience.
Tom Fleming, I live in West Hollywood. I'm on Norwich Drive, and I appreciate the people, they had a meeting with the group, and to answer your question, the house that sits to the south was brought by railroad when San Vicente was a railroad, and they just dumped it on the piece of land. That's why it's set so far back. I strongly agree with the staff's recommendation and think that they should get the permit.
Thank you very much for letting us hear that.
Thank you.
That's it? Okay, then, I suppose, yes?
This is what variances are intended for, like specifically like this type of situation where, you know, one thing is not like the other. So I'm happy to move this. Oh, someone already moved it and already seconded it.
So,
All right, never mind.
So, thank you.
And the motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. Most of our projects don't go that fast, so. Woo, that's good.
That was
All right.
so tiring.
Yep, yeah, it was good.
Chair, let me read the appeal. The
Thank you.
resolution of the Planning Commission just approved memorializes the Commission's final action on this matter. This action is subject to appeal to the City Council. Appeals must be submitted within 10 calendar days from this date to the City Clerk's office. Appeals must be in writing and accompanied by the required fees. The City Clerk's office can provide appeal forms and information about waiver of fees.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll move on now to item 10B, which is 1227 North Formosa. It also is a request for demolishing some dwelling units and to construct, in this case, a larger piece of property. So we have a staff report.
Good evening, Chair Buckner and members of the Commission. I'm Adrian Gaia with the city's current plan division. The property is located on the west side of Formosa Avenue, just south of Fountain Avenue. The streets in this area of Formosa Avenue contain an eclectic mix of multifamily structures of various heights, as well as a number of older single-family residences. Santa Monica Boulevard to the south and La Brea Avenue to the east are fronted with properties developed with commercial uses. The proposal is a request to demolish 2 dwelling units and to construct a 3-story, 5-unit condominium building consisting of 2 residential stories over a semi-subterranean parking area. The townhouse-style development is proposed to contain 7,497 square feet of livable area. All of the units have 3 bedrooms and 3 baths and have an average unit size of 1,499 square feet. The project provides 10 standard parking spaces, 1 guest parking space. 4 of the units have 2 side-by-side dedicated parking spaces, and 1 of the units has a mechanical parking lift for 2 vehicles. The single required guest parking space is located on a rotating turntable at the rear of the property. The project is subject to the green building ordinance. As such, the project is going to be a green building as it will exceed the city's current 60-point green building requirement by proposing a 90-point building. By reaching the 90-point threshold, the project will benefit from one of the green incentives the city provides. As an incentive, the applicant has requested to divide the required 500 square feet of common open space among each of the 5 units' roof decks. The proposed project complies with all city standards for residential districts, multifamily dwellings, and general development standards. The project was reviewed by the Planning Commission Design Review Subcommittee back in May. The subcommittee members responded positively to the design of the project. The subcommittee suggested minor architectural modifications to a few of the buildings, stair towers, to reduce the apparent height. The architect has worked diligently with staff to address those concerns. Gwen Pugh, the city's urban designer, will now talk about the proposed design of the building.
So I've taken a look at a number of projects in the city over the course of the last year or so, and some of the projects are better than others, and I think this is certainly one of those that has such a nice use of materials and of articulation, and just fits into the neighborhood in a very elegant way. I like the way that the front was framed in the sheet metal through there, and how the actual living space portion of that was set back and enlivens the street and really looks out to the street, and I think adds a nice lantern quality to that environment. As you look at the side elevation, you can see an interesting syncopation of the forms that creates a nice rhythm. Frequently projects struggle with asymmetrical design, but this one has worked that into its language and really complemented what's happening in the front elevation. And looking at it brings this around as a 4-sided design and takes the themes and ideas that have been part of the whole project and integrates it. So all in all, I think a very elegant design that is worthy of status as exemplary.
Thank you. You have another something?
One more sentence.
Sure.
The building is designed in a modernist style with all units in a townhouse configuration. The project incorporates sustainable design principles according to the city's green building ordinance. The development is complementary to the context of the neighborhood and is designed to meet the intent and requirements of the city's zoning ordinance. Therefore, staff recommends approval of the project. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions of staff at this point by commissioners? Quiet tonight, that's good. All right, then the applicant can come forward. Again, you're going to have, welcome, good to see you again. You have 10 minutes to address us.
Hi, my name is Andrea Keller, and I live in the city of Los Angeles. I believe that staff and the city's urban designer have explained our design. I want to just walk through it quickly. We did meet with the neighbors, I also wanted to point out, and we were concerned about privacy. We did have some meetings in which they presented their concerns to us, and we took those very seriously and made a lot of changes. At Design Review Subcommittee, we had stair towers that projected above the third floor, and at the request of the committee, we did chop those down, and we worked with Gwyn to reduce them in mass because they were presenting a higher mass in the front. On the front of this project, we do have a living wall on the right side. It was recommended that we keep the mass of the main stair tower. It was reviewed favorably. We have a kind of a clear glass storefront which wraps around the main frame, and below that is a living wall. I did want to point out on the roof, I have two things. I've been talking to staff today about some comments and questions that have come back to us. Oh, here you can see the lines of the roof as we cut it down to minimize the mass on the north side of the building. This is a multifamily neighborhood. There's only one single-family house in the neighborhood, which is adjacent to ours. And the higher point of our mass is on the north side, adjacent to a multifamily structure. On the roof plan, I did want to point out two things. One, in the calculation, this came up as a question today, we've slightly overstated the mass of the front stair tower by about 40 square feet. We are under the 15 square feet, so I wanted to make that clarification to you. I also wanted, from our last meeting, we had a discussion about extensive landscaping, and we had counted all of the planters, which I now understand we cannot do. So we have revised our green points, and we achieved the 90 points, which we must do per code. I do have that if you guys would like to see that. So in evaluating the green points, we found that we could put some of those points into the framing and using more recycled materials, and that we did not need the extensive roof to be part of this count. But we do understand that we need to meet 90 points, and we'll work that through with staff. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask you something. I noticed that they put a condition in the resolution, condition 8.7, requiring larger planters on the roof deck. Has that been addressed already, or is that something that you still have to do?
Yes, one thing that we talked about too is having a sustainable watering system, and having something, we did identify a system that could service the planters for 30 to 40 days at a time, so they would only need to be serviced once per month. We intend to locate these watering devices near the rooftop planters, and they would service not only the rooftop planters, but the one on the floor below as well, because we are proposing planters on a living floor outside of bedrooms, and we don't want the burden of watering those every day to fall upon the occupants.
Okay.
Not that we don't trust them to water their plants, but.
And you've
we'd like
made
to
the depth
make it
of
easy.
those planters a little bit more to accommodate more?
Yes.
More vegetation?
Yes, there was a concern. We wanted to provide privacy and also just soften the edge of the building. So we do have planting all across the the bedroom floor of the structure, as well as the rooftop.
The rooftop.
Surrounding the perimeter.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? No? Yeah, yes. Lynn?
Yes, I'm looking at A1 and A3.2 about the guest parking. It's my understanding from the code that all guest parking must be covered, and this is exposed parking based on the images from 3.2.
Yeah, it is. We're not planning on covering. I don't believe that it needs to be covered, but I can.
Commissioner Hubengarter, the requirement is that guest parkers have the option of being covered or uncovered
For the guest parking?
for the guest parking.
Okay, I'll revisit my notes that I just ran from the zone, and I'll get back to you. But, so How is the trash removed from the trash receptacles that are blocked by the guest parking space when the little truck comes up?
The car does rotate 90 degrees, and so the trash may be removed when the car is in the rotated position, and anyone can rotate the car. We did visit this issue with transportation, and they even came to the site of another installation a little bit further north on Formosa. So this solution has been implemented on both Ogden and Formosa, and we had it tested and vetted and actually made some changes to the plans to ensure that every car could back up and that the car could in fact turn and that trash could be removed. But we did work through this extensively with planning and with transportation.
Okay, it just seems like an accident waiting to happen, a little tight.
Well, several are in use now, and so far, so good.
Okay. And that last bay parking space, how does that individual car exit?
So it's actually a version of tandem parking. It's a stacked parking system. So there is a car lift.
No. The one right next to the guest space.
Oh, next to the guest space. It actually does exit. We've checked the turn radius, and it is possible to exit with a car in the 90-degree rotated position.
No, not the guest itself.
Right.
The left-hand side homeowner space in the last one.
This was tested by
Without-
Adrian and Transportation. They brought a car to an existing site where we have this condition on Formosa, and they did test, and they determined that the backup was workable.
With a car in the
With the
guest
car in
space.
the guest space, that it was possible to back up and turn the car.
So is the car exiting backwards onto the street?
No, it is turning around.
Okay.
I think there were several point turn.
It just wasn't in the diagram, so it was a little hard to judge.
It is possible. We did thoroughly vet this with the city.
Okay.
It was definitely a concern of planning, and we worked with them to adjust the building as we needed to make that work.
Those are all my questions for the architect.
Okay. So you'll have an opportunity to rebut after the members of the community speak, okay?
Thank you.
So we have several speakers.
I just want to disclose that I visited the site.
You visited the site?
Yes.
Thank you. Any other disclosures? Okay. So the first speaker is Judah Heliushe, is that correct? I'm sorry if I messed up your name. When you come to the podium, you'll correct me?
Together, actually.
You're together?
Judah and Dario. Hi there. How are you? Okay. Hi, thank you for hearing us. We just have a few concerns.
You have 3 minutes between you.
Okay, we just have a few concerns. We'll have a quick list, and we just want to say we bought the house like 2 years ago.
Would you state your names and
I'm
your...
Judah, Ben Jehoshua, Dario Nardi.
Yes, why don't I talk since I
Yeah, yeah.
prepared this?
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thank you
You're
so
going to
much.
need to speak in the mic so we can hear you and everybody
Yes.
else can too.
Yeah, my name is Dario Nardi. Thank you. We own the property that is immediately behind this one, so we're on Poinsettia Place. It is a one-story duplex, so needless to say, this unit looms in the view of our backyard. We have appreciated that the architect, it is a stylish unit, and that they've accommodated some of the points that we've raised, but there are still 2 remaining points that we would like to see addressed, as well as several questions that we have. We do believe it's doable for us to fully support this, but we would just like these 2 things in particular to be addressed. One of them remains as a privacy issue, that there's a wraparound window in the back that is from 10 to 20 feet, 22 feet off of the ground. That's how far it spans, 12 feet. But the fence there is only 6 feet, and there are no trees or other plants significantly indicated in that space. So the only view afforded by that window is our backyard and the back of our house. And that's just something that we think could either the window could be minimized or appropriate plant barrier could be offered in that space. And then the second major issue is the developer and architect said in the meeting and in email communications that they would move the power pole, which currently sits incorrectly, I might add, on our property, back into where it's supposed to be. And the plans, the new plans that are drawn up, do in fact show space to accommodate the movement of the power pole. That doesn't interfere with anything else on the property, but the power pole itself still sits on our property. So we were hoping that the plans just could be fully updated to reflect that.
Is the power pole, does that belong to one of the utility companies?
Yeah, there's an easement behind our property that goes between the two properties.
And it's not in the easement?
Correct, it's not in the easement, yes.
Well, wouldn't that be something that would come up, I think, with the utility company to move it?
Oh, right, so we don't necessarily mean that this is, it's just saying that this is something we've been discussing with the architect and with the developer, and they agreed to do something about this. And it looks like they can in fact do that. We just wanted to make sure the plans were updated to show that. So we're just mentioning that.
Okay, so we'll have them address those two issues when they come back.
Then we wanted to make sure in the construction impact report, we've seen that there's information about noise, but about vibration and possible toxic materials in the old structure that's there. We're not sure where to find that in the report. We haven't seen that so far. Just being so close as a property, we want to make sure that it's safe when the demolition occurs. And then one more thing is that the proposal builds to the edge of the property, such as where the trash unit is, and we have plants, and we ourselves already have a proper unit, a sort of garage unit on our property that's only 3 feet from the edge.
So the fence, yeah.
Yeah, so we just want to make sure that there's guarantees that there's no harm to our property.
Okay. Then we'll have them address those issues when they come forward. Thank you very much. The other speakers?
Yeah, it's Roxanne McBride.
Yes, Roxanne McBride. I live right next door, 1221 North Formosa. First of all, you lied, okay?
Excuse me, Ms. McBride.
There's been 2 meetings that said that we will not have balconies on the side of the property. I have a picture right here that shows balconies. That overlooks my privacy.
Please talk to the commission and not to the audience. You come
Okay,
speak to us.
I'm very upset because I came here thinking that they actually were going to follow through with their word at their last meeting and said absolutely no balconies overlooking my property. In this picture, I see there's balconies now.
Okay.
You can check with Scott Lunsford. He was at the meeting, and I have over 10 witnesses that said they were not going to put balconies. Now it's changed. This is exactly why you need to listen to people that come here instead of just throwing these properties through, because I have lived there 26 years. I spent a fortune on my backyard, making it a safe haven for me, a quiet space. And now I have balconies of people overlooking my privacy. That's not okay. I'm completely against this property now, this whole thing. I was for it until I saw the picture tonight with the balconies that were absolutely promised they were not going to be put intact. They were first in the first meeting, in the first project pictures, they were there. Then they took them out for the second. And I was suspicious that they would sneak them in, thinking maybe I wouldn't show up. But I do have 10 witnesses to prove that they did not have it in the second meeting. So with that said, I'm concerned with what they also promised now that I see their balconies. Are they going to destroy the hedge? They said they were going to keep the hedge. That it's about 12 feet. That it is in between both properties, and once they start digging down, that obviously can be destroyed. What is their plans? Are they going to replace it? There's no word of that. And also there's a wood fence that separates the property. What happens if that gets destroyed? Are they going to replace that? So there's a lot here that needs to be addressed. And, you know, I just think that yes, it looks pretty, but I am so upset that they're putting balconies that are going to literally overlook my whole side yard. So I just can't support it. And now that I know this, I'm going to really rally the troops in my neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, applicant rebuttal, you'll have 5 minutes.
I'd like to speak to the first comments. We did discuss the utility pole, and it is improperly located, and we understand that it does need to be relocated. We're very happy to work with the utility to do that, and we've identified a spot, so we're very happy to accommodate that. Regarding privacy hedges, we absolutely do want to maintain the hedge on the south, and we would like to put them in on the west and the north side as requested, so we're very happy to accommodate that. Regarding the balconies, we did originally have projecting balconies, and Roxanne had expressed her dislike of projecting balconies. As you can see in the plan, they are no longer projecting, and it's more of a Juliet. On A 2.1, we had originally had a habitable balcony that had room for tables and chairs, and we compressed. There is a railing there, but there's actually no space behind it except to barely sit. So it's not a true balcony. There's no habitation of that space. We had deleted that at her request. And I also wanted to stress at the second floor, there's no way to see from those. In the bathroom, the windows are higher, and there are planters from the bed between the bedroom and the edge. So we've made a lot of effort to obscure the view of the neighboring property from this one. But we did collapse the balconies.
Looking at A 2.1, then, the Juliet balconies are where the kitchen and living room are, correct?
Yeah, so it's a frame that contains a life safety rail, but it is in no way habitable. There can't be a table and chairs out there. It's a narrow, someone could open that sliding door.
So it's a floor-to-ceiling window with a Juliet balcony?
It's a floor-to-ceiling window with a balcony on the exterior.
But it's only the fencing or the balcony.
It's the fencing that shows in this picture.
For safety, right? So
Yes, and it's not possible to put a dining table or to have, all of that was compressed. So we had started this project with actual seating, a table and 2 chairs, and all of that was compressed. So
how deep are the balconies? Is that opening now?
They're about 30 inches
30
of
inches?
projection. But the frame is inset, so it's about 24 inches of space.
Okay, and let's see, what else did we talk about? The hedges, the balconies. What about the demolition and possible toxic materials? Are you going to make sure that when you demolish the building that there's protections?
Absolutely.
Any other questions? None?
Question of staff. Is there a standard condition about toxic materials on demolition?
It's covered in the construction mitigation plan.
It's in the mitigation, right? Generally is. Okay. Any other? Then we'll close the public hearing at this point. Anything from the commissioners? Comments? Want to make a motion?
I have a comment, and it is very similar to the one I made on the applicant's project from our last meeting, and that is I just am consistent on this. The building walls against our sidewalks creates an unfriendly environment and creates an unsafe environment. And they've built I recognize, my mic went off. I recognize that the owners of this property in the future could come in and put a different fence in, and that would be their right. But I hate to start out a brand new residents in our neighborhood already walling them off from the neighborhood, and it makes it less of a walkable city, and I just have a real problem with that.
You're talking about the low fencing around in the front building?
It shows a low fencing here. In other pictures we have, it shows a very tall fence that's over 4 feet tall. So I don't know which one it is.
Ask them how tall it's going to be?
If I'm happy to hear that, but I don't know that it would matter for me, but.
We had originally proposed a 42-inch fence, and again, in the neighborhood meeting, they had asked that we make a 6-foot fence. I am happy to ask the owners. I think they would consider a 42-inch fence, and with landscaping in front of it, and to make a green belt in front of it. So I think we were responding to the neighborhood meeting in putting that fence in. The idea was that it be very open, that it be very natural, that the stucco portion not exceed 42 inches, and that it be very
Well, and
open.
I like what's proposed here, where there's at least some planting.
Yeah, this
in
is
front of
exactly
it,
what we want to do. This
as
is-
opposed to
it's
the one where it literally, on the front of our pages here, where it literally abuts the sidewalk, from what
No,
I can tell.
we do plan to have a green belt in front of that. That is our design.
I personally still hate the fence, but I think the planting in front of it is better.
Okay.
That's all I have on this.
Thank you. I'm going to leave the public hearing
Chair?
open just in case. Do you have questions?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner.
Well, I guess this is more of a comment and a question. Again, similar to the project we reviewed at the last meeting, we're looking at an entire first floor, ground floor of parking. Yes, I understand it's down 3 feet, but effectively, the ground floor entrances go straight into the garage. They don't go into living space except for the very front unit. And, you know, the general plan, when we increase the heights in all of these various districts, the general plan was designed so that that would increase the amount of housing in the space. And by putting parking on the ground floor, you're effectively taking out another whole level of housing. So I'm very concerned about setting a precedent where we systematically start taking away housing by providing parking at the ground level instead of putting the ground in a subterranean fashion like many of the other projects that we've looked at. Similar, back to the aging in place and ADA issues around these kinds of units, you're talking about walking in a front door and immediately having to climb a staircase just to get to the main living space. So I find that this isn't really addressing a number of the issues that we are very conscious about in our general plan. I also am concerned about the roof projections being so incredibly high. It's effectively adding a fourth story to the building, and it's not complying with our 1 foot setback for every 1 foot over the limit requirement. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Altschul?
Thank you. The property previously had one single-family house and an accessory dwelling unit. That is being demolished to replace it with 5 units of housing. So it's demonstrable that this is not taking away housing, and that the fact that the garage and the parking is somewhat on ground level, at grade, is not in fact taking away any housing. And I would move to adopt the staff's recommendation with a couple of additional conditions. Number one, that according to what the applicant has agreed to and what Ms. McBride pointed out, that the power pole, or that the gentleman pointed out, that the power pole will be removed and relocated.
If they get permission from the utility company, because they've got to deal with that too, right?
Yes, and that the applicant will cooperate and work with the utility company to effect that to the best of their ability.
Thank you.
Also, that the existing height of the fences and hedges that now protect the privacy to the extent that it can of the properties adjoining be maintained.
I'll chime in.
Yes.
I like the design.
That's my motion.
Is there a second?
I'm sorry.
We have to second the motion.
I'll second the motion.
Okay.
Now Can I discuss the motion?
Discuss the motion, yes, thank you.
I agree with everything Commissioner Altschul said, and I also I like the design. And you know, I like, you know, this architect has come through many times before, and she does a very thorough job. And yeah, I mean, I don't have much to say other than that. I like the project.
Yeah. Any other comments on the motion?
I have a question for legal. Given that there's going to be, we're effectively waiving the requirements on the roof projection setbacks, does that need to be specifically addressed in the motion and in the resolution?
Adrian's going to handle that question.
You're referring to the stair towers in the on the top. The front stair tower is seen as a architectural projection, so it doesn't have the one-for-one requirement that you would see for mechanical equipment. And that goes along with the remaining 4 towers on the roof. So they're all seen as architectural projections to enhance the design of the building. So they're separate from mechanical equipment, which has a one-for-one requirement and the 50% cap on the roof.
So as long as we call it an architectural embellishment, even though it's a roof projection, it's de facto waived?
Correct.
Interesting. Okay. And yes, in table 3.6, parking requirements by land use. Duplexes, multifamily dwellings, condominiums, townhouses with 3 or more bedrooms are required to have one covered space guest parking for each 4 units. I don't see any exception to covered space.
We just looked that up right now. I'll give you the section that it's on. 19.28.090D5, which allows for guest parking to be uncovered as an option.
So we have 2 different standards to the same requirement?
You know, we're having a discussion on the motion now that...
Well, but the question is about, we're making a variance, you know, by approving this motion. I mean, we are, if in fact this is the requirement, one covered space, et cetera, then we are waiving that requirement via our motion.
If you look in the guest parking section that Adrian just cited, that's where it says, and it's a specific section for guest parking, that the guest parking can be uncovered.
So there is no variance or exception.
So there's 2 separate rules in 2 separate places that say 2 different things?
Yeah. I'm not familiar with the other section, but the code also does say that in the case that there is a discrepancy, that the least restrictive requirement be the one that rules. So that if there is that case, we would go with the uncovered.
Perhaps that might be something we want to address and make some consistent zoning ordinances. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other? So, are we ready for a vote?
Yep.
Okay.
And the motion passes, 6 ayes, 1 no by Commissioner Hoopengarner.
We just have one more item.
The resolution the Planning Commission just approved memorializes the Commission's final action on this matter. This action is subject to appeal to the City Council. Appeals must be submitted within 10 calendar days from this date to the City Clerk's office. Appeals must be in writing and accompanied by the required fees. The City Clerk's office can provide appeal forms and information about waiver of fees.
Okay, there's been a request for a short continuance, so we'll take...
Break.
Huh?
Short break.
Short break. I meant, that's what I meant, a continuance of the meeting or a break. Sorry, I misspoke. 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, now we'll be back in session, and we're moving on to the next item. It's 10C. What happened to our staff? Oh, I guess we're not going to move on yet. Give us a few more minutes. Sorry. I saw all the commissioners here. I thought it was okay. How rude.
Could I make a disclosure now while we're waiting, or should we wait till
Oh,
staff
let's
gets
wait
back?
for everybody to
Okay.
be here. Thank
I
you.
didn't know. Trying to use the time wisely.
Don't we do disclosures once we close public comment?
Yeah.
That's when we do disclosures.
Yeah, we're going to do disclosures when we close public comment, usually. That's, so everybody be prepared for that. Remind me. No, well, before, probably, yeah. After the staff report. That's cool. That's okay. It's good. Yeah, it's okay. Got told? Okay. Okay, moving on then now to 10C. Thank you for your patience out there. Staff report, Lori?
Good evening, Commissioners. Before you tonight is a request to demolish 4 dwelling units in order to construct a new 3-story, 8-unit apartment building over subterranean parking. The project proposes the demolition of 2 residential buildings that consist of 4 dwelling units. The proposed project complies with the standards for residential districts, multifamily dwellings, and general development standards. The building is well-designed and is consistent with the massing of dwelling units in the surrounding neighborhood. The applicant is electing to pay the affordable housing impact fee in lieu of providing on-site affordable units. This portion of West Norton Avenue is developed primarily with multifamily buildings of varying heights. The proposed project will earn a total of 90 green building points. To allow for flexibility throughout the design development of a project, the green building points may change between applicant approval of planning permits and approval of building permits. However, the minimum number of 90 points will be conditioned in the project and must be reached. Overall, the proposed project meets the general plan goals of the multifamily development standards, is well suited for the subject site, is thoughtfully designed, and is complementary to the context of the neighborhood. Staff received an email from a neighbor in support of the project that was provided to you earlier this evening. Staff recommends approval of this project. Staff, the applicant, and the architect are available for any questions you may have. Thank you.
Any questions of staff before we go on? Okay, then we'll have our applicant come forward and address the commission.
Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. My name is Jeff Seymour with the Seymour Consulting Group. We're out of Westlake Village. It's good to be here. I want to tell you that this has been really a fascinating project for us. I want to begin by commending both Lori Yelton and Gwen Pugh. This was really a partnership. When we brought this to city initially, the design was very different than what it is now. This is, as was mentioned, an 8-unit rental project replacing 2 structures totaling 4 units in the R4A zone. But what was not really said was the challenge that came with a project that is basically on a piece of property that's 50 feet wide and 150 feet long, deep. So we worked diligently with the city. We had approximately 6 meetings with Ms. Yelton and with Mr. Pugh to come to what we believe to be really an outstanding project. The project is going to be presented to you by our architect, Brian Moran. He is also here to speak to the landscape, the softscape issues, and as well as the green building point scores, which you may have questions in regard to. The essence of what we are trying to do today is provide you with as much information as we can to make this a project which we think you and the city will be proud of. So with that, I'm going to ask Brian to come up, and we'll be here to respond to any questions you may have, and we thank you for your consideration.
Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Brian Moran, City of Los Angeles, from Aero Collective, who we've been privileged to work on this project. So I'm just going to, Jeff fortunately took care of most of the basics. I'm just going to run kind of through the design and how we kind of became where we are now with the design. So the overall thesis of this project was really kind of to come up with a courtyard, kind of a communal space in the center of the building, something that, you know, is difficult to kind of achieve. So we kind of pulled the massing of the building apart, moved the bulk of the massing back to the commercial behind us, and try to impact Norton with the least amount of the massing of the building. So it was really kind of important to us to create that courtyard, to create an area where all the tenants potentially will come through the walkway to the east side of the building, and then all the units are entered off of that kind of courtyard. We worked diligently with staff and Gwen Pugh, and he actually brought up a great point of moving the tree well to the basement, which I think really adds something that's unique to this project, and adds a light well to have in the basement, so we're not having, you know, your typical condition when you're waiting for your elevator in a basement, that it's a dark and damp space. So we really thought that kind of connection and really brought something unique and, you know, really kind of tied the building together. So a few of the other elements, you know, we've also tried to create a communal space there, having a water feature, a bench, and then, you know, to talk about the kind of its context of the buildings, I mean, we're next to two, you know, unique, similar buildings in size, and we're, you know, at our 35-foot height limit, but we tried to address the, you know, the buildings are adjacent to us, and kind of really look at those buildings and kind of react to them and kind of look and take our cues from there. So we looked at that, and so I think you can see that in our elevations that were in your package, where you are seeing kind of the building to our west, the dingbat building, that we're kind of reacting towards that. So we really strive to create a unique space that kind of fits in with the overall neighborhood, and then also is unique and interesting. At the street front, we worked diligently with staff to kind of create this green beltway and have plantings there. We've worked to make sure that there's a minimum of 3 feet of planting, so everything has plenty of soil depth. And we did that because we wanted to have kind of a lush kind of feeling on the street. Unfortunately, our landscape architect's car broke down on the way here. I will have to answer their questions as best as I can, but I will do my best in that. I think that pretty much covers my main building topics. Thank you.
Okay. So you have an opportunity to come back and speak to us after the public comment section. So we want to do our disclosures?
Disclosures.
Yeah. That's what I'm thinking. Disclosures at this time. I do have a disclosure. I spoke briefly with Jeff Seymour, who's the representative, on the telephone, just briefly, and all of our discussion was on items that are in the report. None?
I also spoke with Mr. Seymour and discussed items that are contained in the staff report, as well as I visited the site.
I met with the sorry, Commissioner Allison,
Sorry.
go ahead.
I also had a brief telephone conversation with Mr. Seymour and discussed items solely contained within the report.
I had a brief telephone conversation with Mr. Seymour, and we contained what was discussed what was contained in the staff report.
Same for me.
I had a brief conversation with Mr. Seymour, who wanted to talk about plants.
Okay. Then we'll move on then to the public part. First speaker will be John Renfield, followed by Jovi Donato.
Hi, my name's John Renfield. I live in West Hollywood. Actually, I live right there, and that's my concern. I've never done this before, sorry. Even in the diorama, if that's what you call this, that building, I mean, I live on the first floor at 8110 Norton, and there's a lot of nice light that comes in to the living room, and there's a really wonderful old growth tree that's right there. Apparently, the first thing that'll happen to put that building up is to kill this tree. That kind of doesn't seem so right. There's a lot of trees on that spot. There is an opening. There's a little building in the back and a bigger building up front. And when I rented the place, I'm just a renter 4 years ago, it's lovely, you know. Another issue, my concern is I have a cat who's like kind of asthmatic, and I have 5 air cleaners constantly going in my apartment for her health. And I'm really concerned about the dust, and that is an older building, and whatever asbestos that's going to be torn down from that thing, I'm probably going to have to move, because I can't possibly see them containing that amount of dust. I already have to keep all the windows closed. I'm just wondering, you know, what happens then? You know, it doesn't seem, I don't know, if you have to kill a tree like that to make this, I mean, it doesn't seem so right. And if you look at that diagram right there, it looks like about 5 feet between my living room and that building. So it's going to be like the world's darkest walkway. I'll never see sky again if I intend on living where I do right now. And that's just my concerns. It just seems it's going to be very loud, very dusty, very noisy, and pretty unhealthy. Thank you for letting me speak.
Can you point to which your building is? Because I couldn't quite tell from it.
I live down there.
Okay.
Right there, which is like, right now, it's open sky, and now this is going to, I live down there. I've been living in a basement. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. The next speaker is Jovi Donato, followed by Deborah Freeman.
I am Jovi Donato, and I live in Los Angeles.
Jovi, could you pull the mic down a little bit?
Sorry.
There you go.
I'm
Thank you.
short.
That's all right. We just want to hear you.
I just want to let the commission know that I'm totally in favor of this project. I think I like the way, as a designer and architecturally trained, I like the way it was planned with landscape inside the courtyard. Like when you live in an apartment, it's difficult to find something like that. And exterior-wise, it blends in with the neighborhood. That's it.
Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Deborah Freeman.
Hello, Deborah Freeman. I live, I'm a resident of West Hollywood, and I'm here kind of to second what the first speaker said. One concern I had was just that there's going to be, it looks like an elevator near our bedroom, so I just wanted to make sure that, I'm sure it has been thought out, but I just wanted to make sure it had been thought out that it's not going to be some crazy, noisy elevator right near where we sleep. And I think that's probably the only thing that I'm really justified in bringing up, but I will say, since he said it, I've lived in my apartment for over a decade, and I look out at these beautiful trees, and it's just been like one of my favorite things about living where I live. It's just beautiful light, beautiful trees by my window, and my understanding is I'm just gonna have wall there. I'm not sure if any light is gonna come in. It looks like no. As I said, I don't know that I have any rights when it comes to this, and I understand that it might not matter what I say, but I just thought I would state it just in case. I love the light, I also love the trees, and I hope the elevator isn't waking us up. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. David?
Yes, we have just one. He chose, I believe he's already left, but he chose, he opposes staff's recommendation regarding this item. His name is Roberto Nabaza.
Okay, thank you. And the applicant want to come forward, especially the architect, want to address some of the comments from the public?
The architect will speak to the light and to the trees. In relation to dust, we are obviously within the confines of the code. We will be as diligent as we can possibly be, as is required under the conditions of approval. And you know, we want to be considered good neighbors, and we believe this project will be of substantial positive to the neighborhood. So, but Brian is going to speak to the light and to the tree.
Thank you.
Thank you. So right, for the light, we've tried to mitigate it as much as possible, in which we're at our 6-foot setback from our property line. We understand that this building is taller than the existing buildings, but we are, at our space. Our building is white. I mean, it's not the same as looking at a skylight, but we've tried to be respectful. It's not a dark material, so it's not going to create, hopefully, a dark cavern. When we originally laid out the buildings, so that elevation there, that is not the walkway section of that. Like, for those units, you actually enter on the other side, but we try to still be respectful that those are, they're getting light there, but we've tried to allow as much as possible and not to create a dark well there with our material choices.
What about the trees?
So the trees that are existing there are all, so we are a fully subterranean garage. Unfortunately, in order to develop the site, we have to take down the existing trees. There's not a way around that.
Is there space to put trees back in there after you're done, so that there's green?
We have the whole entire perimeter of the property is to have hedges along it, and we have allowed for depth so that we can have substantial height for those hedges, and we could potentially look into adding. We could work with staff with adding, maybe trees on that elevation to create to kind of mitigate that as much as possible. And we would be willing to work with that. On the elevator, it is an elevator on that side, but it is a fully enclosed as part of the building, so there will be no sound, no vibrations, none of that. It's a fully enclosed elevator, no moving parts. None of the doors or anything open up to the west, so it shouldn't have any noise issues.
Can you, what are the species of the trees? Are we certain they're not protected live oaks or any protected trees?
Yes, I believe they are not. There are no live oaks there.
Or California oaks?
Yeah, or California.
Okay.
And is it your intention to replace the trees that you remove with mature trees?
It is our intention to.
Let's put it this way. Would you agree to replace them with mature trees?
As long as we believe that they would be, that our planting depths and everything would support them, yeah. I think we would love to have as big of trees. So one of the original ideas
I think this can be answered yes or no.
Yes.
Thank you.
Do your best. Okay. Maybe trees instead of hedges, because the trees will provide some foliage. Just a thought.
I think the original from working with staff was for the privacy hedges along the property, but I think we'd be happy to add that on top of the hedges.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Really, really quickly, and I'm definitely not the expert at reading plans up here, so forgive me that this might be an obvious answer, but the elevator distance from the building next to it, because the building is set back 6 feet, but then you have the ramp that goes behind the elevator. So the elevator will actually be 16 feet away from the next property line. Am I reading that correctly? Okay.
Correct.
So there's an additional 10 feet. It's not right up against the setback.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other comments? Okay. Then we'll close the public hearing. at this time, and we can have a motion, or we can have discussion. Let's have discussion first, and then if somebody's ready to make a motion, we can do it. Anybody have any comments?
I'll start.
Thank you.
I'm very, very pleased with this project. I'm very excited about a reintroduced courtyard. I think that there's a lot of interesting architectural components. I got a giggle out of what I call the Jetson mushroom. But I think that you've really worked well to try and achieve some of a modern version of some of our historical buildings. And in that respect, I think that this is a lovely project. I would agree that obviously putting a mature tree in that space, especially you're going to have to drop it in, you're probably going to have to helicopter it in, is going to be a challenge. But I would encourage, the more mature the tree, the more access it'll have to the light to begin with, and the more successful it will be in its growth in subsequent years. So I'm not sure, I couldn't tell from the plans what you had specified to begin with as the tree. It almost looked like a palm tree, I wasn't sure.
Mm-hmm.
Correct, it's a palm tree. So we're looking to have one that, obviously is out and is as mature as possible in that location.
Yeah.
Okay. And my only other comment, and I said this to Jeff, is that the Mexican feathergrass is an invasive species. And so I wouldn't, it depends on, the Latin name that you specified is different from the common name. The Latin name is not an invasive, it's a California native, and I want to make sure that that would be what would be planted and not the common name Mexican feathergrass.
I did speak, when I heard that the landscape architect or car was broken down, he did give me his alternative, which, in part of my Latin, is Festuca marii, and it's a similar plant, has similar water usage, and we would be happy to swap that with it.
As long as it's not an invasive species, it's all good.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
I would make the motion to approve the staff's recommendation.
I'll second it. Someone did.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor to approve the staff recommendation. Second, let's have a vote.
And the motion passes unanimously. The resolutions the Planning Commission just approved memorializes the Commission's final action on this matter. This action is subject to appeal to the City Council. Appeals must be submitted within 10 calendar days from this date to the City Clerk's office. Appeals must be in writing and accompanied by the required fees. The City Clerk's office can provide appeal forms and information about waiver of fees. And Madam Chair, staff has requested a 10-minute break.
10-minute break, okay. Could I have all the commissioners back on the dais? I think our staff is ready to. Okay, back in session, and we're going to move on to the next item, which is item D, 10D, and we're going to be dealing with some zone text amendment issues.
Good evening, Madam Chairwoman, Commissioners. My name is Rachel Diamond. I'm a senior planner in the Long Range and Mobility Planning Division, City. And tonight we have a number of text amendments for you related to multifamily projects in the city. These amendments stemmed from some direction from Council after a larger multifamily discussion that ultimately boiled down into direction to look at 3 items. The first is looking at eliminating the existing 90% density requirements for the R3 and R4 districts. The second is to address height of new development in the R3 and 4 districts, and also to streamline the development review process to incentivize projects that do not request height bonuses. I'll start with the 90% density requirement. The 90% density requirement was established in 2009 in order to require that projects build a minimum of 90% of their allowable density on the site. So for example, if a project is required to build is allowed to build 10 units, they would be required to build a minimum of 9 units. And this was to help bolster the number of units that were being built, and essentially at this point now, the projects that are left that have not been redeveloped or vacant land that has not been developed are having some trouble reaching that 90% density requirement. And it also pushes projects potentially to be larger than they would actually prefer in some cases. So essentially what staff is recommending is that the 90% density requirement be eliminated, and that in its place, there is a provision that there be no net loss in dwelling units on the site. However, if the existing number of dwelling units would exceed the allowable number of units on the site, a project will be required to construct actually 100% of the allowable units. And in this case, the director could also approve a reduction in required units under unusual circumstances. So I give you a little bit of a breakdown. I used just kind of a sample project, a building that, or a site that would allow 10 units, for example, in the R4 district. The minimum units required under the 90% density rule would require that they build 9 units. So I gave you a few different scenarios, and I'll start with the first one. If there's 2 existing units on site, as an example, the new requirements would require that they build a minimum of 2 units on the site. And so if they built that minimum number of units at the 1,500 square foot average maximum unit size, which will still remain in place, this would be about a 3,000 square foot building. Again, they could build up to those 10 units, but it gives them the flexibility to build between 2 and 10. Again, the market typically dictates this, and ultimately we do see larger projects, but it does give them the freedom and flexibility. We particularly see issues with being able to park a lot of these units. The second example is that there are 5 existing units on site. So in this case, they would be required under the 90% density law to still build 9. If there were 5 existing units on site, we would require a minimum of 5 units. Again, with the 1,500 square foot average maximum unit size, you'd get about a 7,500 square foot building at a minimum. However, again, they can still build between the 5 and 10. In another scenario, if you had 10 units allowed by zoning, And again, the minimum under the 90% density would be 9 units. And there were 10 units on site today, the maximum allowed. They would actually be required to have a no net loss in units, which would be those 10 units. Again, with 1,500 square foot average maximum unit size, it'd be about a 15,000 square foot building. So in that case, they actually would have to build the 10 or more with a density bonus, which would allow you up to 35% bonus. And the last scenario is the complicated one, which is the legally non-conforming building. Zoning allows 10 units, but there are 15 units on site. In this case, there is no ability for us to allow them to do the 15 units. And in this case, they would be required to build a minimum of the 10 that's allowed by zoning. Again, they could build a few more units with their, if they utilize the density bonus, but they would be required to replace the 10 units out of those 15. Actually, you know what, I'll go ahead and pause and see if anyone has any questions while we're on this item. Is that okay?
Everybody okay with that? Understand?
Okay, we'll keep moving. The second item was evaluating height in R3 and R4. As you know, height can be a controversial issue in this city and in any city. And particularly when we started looking at height and what we could do to alleviate concerns about height in projects, we started considering a number of options. The first thing that we looked at was, can we lower height? In all of these districts shown, there are a number of R3 and R4 districts, and they vary from 25 to 45 feet, 2 to 4 stories. Could we lower these by 1 story or lower them in a certain way? Ultimately, it was determined not only would we have to revisit the general plan, but when we went to council, they had kind of directed us out of reducing the height out of concern for changes in state density bonus law. So we looked at a number of issues, and really when it came down to it, the issue really boiled down to the utilization of the height concession and the addition of 1 extra story when utilizing the state density bonus. When you build affordable housing on a site, you're allowed to get up to 35% extra units, and then you can also take advantage of concessions that are listed within the city and are enabled by state law. These are the concessions as listed in the West Hollywood Municipal Code, and as you can see, an additional story not to exceed 10 feet of total project height is the #1 listed concession. We are not saying that we are eliminating the ability to ask for a concession for an additional story, but we've essentially highlighted that as our #1 concession versus some of the other concessions that I think we wanted to highlight and promote. So B is a 10% reduction in rear setback. There's also reductions in common open space requirements and private open space requirements. And then we have G, the kind of catch-all other regulatory concessions, and this is the existing language that results in identifiable financially sufficient and actual cost reductions. So what staff is proposing is to eliminate the height concession from the list. So we would strike item A, and then height concessions would be rolled into that other category. And the reason that we did this was, again, the state would still enable people to ask for that height extra story, but we wanted to highlight some of the other options that people have on the table, and people are very well aware that the other is a catch-all for a number of concessions that are not listed here. It truly is a deviation from a majority of our development standards. And so the height concession, and included in other concessions, we changed the language as well to be updated to our updated state density bonus law changes that have been enacted this past year that would result in identifiable and actual cost reductions to provide for affordable housing costs or for rents for the affordable units. We did eliminate the financial sufficiency language, which is consistent with state law. I know there was concern from the public regarding this statement, the financial sufficiency. There was an error on page 4 of your staff report that included the financial sufficiency language. However, if you look at your ordinance attachment A that includes the zone text language, financial sufficiency is struck from the language per state law. But what we did add was, again, in concert with state law, that the applicant provide documentation establishing eligibility for the concession under state law, which includes what cost reductions result and how those reductions provide for affordable housing costs or rent. And then the one additional piece that we did, we wanted to try to Again, highlight the concessions that, that we knew were things that we wanted to promote, but that when you have a situation with an other concession, it typically creates a project that is unique and different and a bit more complex. And we wanted to provide the opportunity for the public to weigh in on those projects that have kind of an outstanding circumstance. And so as a result, the use of the other concessions would require Planning Commission review. So you would see a project no matter how many units, as long as they were utilizing that other concession. That doesn't mean that it changes the determinations that can be made, whether it be on a staff or Planning Commission review, but it allows the public to provide comment in a public forum. So this gives you, so why don't we break a second? If there are any questions, I can take those regarding that item. So moving on, and this kind of plays off of the last one, you know, we added the provision that the other concession would be part of the Planning Commission review. But the third request from council was really to look at streamlining the development review process for smaller projects. And so today's regulations in R3, you can have a staff review with 4 units or less. And Planning Commission review occurs for 5 units or more and all condominium projects. In R4, the existing regulation requires that 8 units or less, or 9 with 1 affordable unit, go for staff review. And if it's 9 or more units, or 10 with 1 affordable, and any condominiums, would go to the Planning Commission for review. So we looked at kind of, you know, what kind of projects are coming in, what the standard sizes of lots are in this city, and what the density provides for those lots. So we looked at fairly standard lot sizes for R3 and R4, and ultimately found that, you know, the increasing the threshold would, in a very minor way, would capture kind of a very standard single lot in the R3 and then R4 districts. So what staff is proposing is that 6 units or less be staff approvable in the R3 district, and 7 or more units go to Planning Commission in the R3 district. In the R4 district, it would be 12 units or less that could be staff reviewed, and 13 or more would be reviewed by the Planning Commission. In addition, what staff is proposing is to separate the condo map review from the development permit review. Today, all condominiums, if there's 2 condominiums, 50 condominiums, they all come to Planning Commission. And ultimately, you know, as is done in a number of other cities, staff wanted to separate those 2 items to allow for smaller projects to go through a standard staff approval, and then have the condo map, which is actually required by state law to come before you, to still come before you. There are separate findings for those 2 different permits, so there would be slightly different purview, but ultimately staff felt like this could help streamline the development review process. I just kind of wanted to walk through kind of the difference between staff review and Planning Commission review. You guys see all of the Planning Commission review, but tend not to see projects that are staff reviewed. So just walking through a staff review, when someone comes in for an application and it's determined that it's something that could be staff approvable, staff does a zoning conformance and design review internally. The design review occurs with the city's urban designer, and essentially, you know, we work with the developers to improve the project design and look at, you know, bulk mass and scale, and make it a better project. That process isn't by no means a way to arbitrarily, you know, deny a project, but ultimately, you know, when it's a staff review, we try to get projects to a place where we can approve them. So we help the architects and developers along with their design and with zoning issues as well. There is notice for staff review projects. There is a site posting that occurs on the site, and there is a 10-day window where people can provide comment to staff, and that's posted on the site in a 2-foot by 3-foot sign on the site at the property line adjacent to the sidewalk. For projects that are 5 units or more, and this is how the code is written today, we are not proposing to change that. 5 units or more would have a community meeting. And because there is a community meeting, we would send a mailer to people within a 500-foot radius of that property. And so ultimately, you know, people do weigh in. They have the ability to to provide comment to both staff and the developer in those meetings, and typically staff would work with the developer to address those comments, and ultimately that results in a staff determination related to the entitlement that's being requested, which is it would be, let's say, a staff resolution that would outline the approval of the project with all of the conditions that generally that you see in all of your projects. They're almost identical, if not identical, to the types of conditions that are placed on a staff approvable project. When a project goes for Planning Commission review, that same zoning conformance and design review occurs internally as it does in a staff approvable project. Ultimately, when it's the community notice, there's always a community meeting for projects that go to Planning Commission. And as such, a 500-foot radius mailer is sent for the community meeting as well as for the meeting itself. There is a site posting, same way that there is for staff review, but ultimately they're directed to send an email to staff or to come to the meeting. And there is also a newspaper posting. Ultimately, anything that goes to Planning Commission would go to Design Review Subcommittee and then to the Planning Commission for final review. So that just kind of outlines the difference between those two processes and noticing. I know there has been concern about the ability for people to understand what's going on in their neighborhood, and I outlined a number of kind of options for noticing should you wish to increase noticing for any staff reviewed projects. There were a number of questions from the public. And so I wanted to address a few of those directly. The first was related to, can the city review maps separately from the development permit? And I touched upon that a little bit earlier when I talked about separating the condo map from the development permit itself. Essentially, yes, absolutely. The city can separate these items, and essentially the development permit would be reviewed on an administrative level, subject to the approval of a tract map should they wish to be a condominium. They could always revert just to an apartment, and that happens sometimes where a tract map is approved and a final map is never recorded. The question from the public specifically cited a CEQA code section that talks about piecemealing of projects. That code section is actually how staff determines whether a project is categorically exempt from CEQA. And so one of the things that I think is important to point out is that the impacts to the environment per CEQA don't change whether you're a condominium or you're an apartment. The building and the things that go into the building and the relationship to the environment are what create those impacts versus the ownership scenario. So ultimately that provision relates to if we were to take a project and kind of split it into tiny little pieces to suddenly make it categorically exempt, that would be in violation of CEQA's rules. But this is not related to the actual CEQA determination, and ultimately staff would look at the overall project for a CEQA determination of categorical exemption, or if we would go forward with, for example, an initial study and then look at potentially a full-blown EIR for larger projects. The next question that we had come up was the difference between an incentive and a waiver, and I'll hand it over to Lauren.
Sure, I'm going to handle the last two questions. I think I've said to you before that the state density bonus law is one of the most convoluted statutes that we have. It's about 14 pages long, and the legislature changes it almost every year. And so, we do our best to keep up with it, but we wanted to just take a few minutes to talk about two questions that came up that really get into kind of the weeds of the density bonus law, but it's important to talk about, and it's related to the proposal tonight. So Rachel touched on this briefly. What is the difference between an incentive and a waiver? And to complicate matters further, the statute uses the word incentive and concession interchangeably. In our code, we call them concessions, but sometimes it makes more sense if you think of them as an incentive, because what it is if you provide a certain amount of affordable housing, you get your bonus, and then you're also eligible for other incentives, which are reductions in certain development standards that are intended to reduce the cost of your projects to help cover the costs for providing the affordable units. So it's an incentive to providing these affordable units. You get some sort of reduction in development standards. A waiver is something that's different. It's a completely different deviation from the standards in the state density bonus law. If you have a project that has your density that's allowed under the state density bonus law, your bonus, and your incentives, And with all of that, if there is still a code section that would physically preclude the construction of the project, the developer can ask to also waive that standard. There's very little case law on this, and so I can't give you many examples because we don't have much direction from the court, but it's something that is in the density bonus law. It's been in there for many, many years. We're starting to see more developers ask for waivers. The incentive program is obviously codified in our code. The waivers come directly from state law, and when we get the requests for them, we process them in accordance with the state law. Okay, the second question we got is, can the city require an applicant to provide documentation establishing eligibility for the concession? For many years, the state density bonus law was silent on this. And in 2016, the legislature added new language to density bonus law. And it said that the city cannot require the developer to provide a study. But what you can require is reasonable documentation to establish eligibility for a requested bonus, incentive, concession, waiver, or reduction in parking. And so then it goes on to say, for purposes of the subdivision, study does not include this reasonable documentation to establish eligibility for your concession as that term is defined. And a concession is defined as your reduction in development standards that result in identifiable and actual cost reductions to provide for your affordable housing costs or rents. So again, the purpose of a concession or an incentive is to reduce costs as an incentive and to help you meet your affordable housing costs. So a reasonable application of that is that you can ask for, and we put the language directly from state law into the code to help us determine that if you're asking for other, that F section, the other type of incentive that could be anything, that you tell the city that it helps you reduce the costs. This is simply on the front end to help explain that what you're asking for is in line with what the legislature had in mind for your concession.
Well, you just have to ask for it. You don't have to explain how it's going to.
That's what we're saying. We're adding language into the code that says, if you're asking for something that's not on the menu, tell us how it reduces your costs. That's all it says.
Okay, I always have issues with that reasonable.
So what we tried to do, so the statute says
There's
reasonable.
no case law that controls that, right?
No, there isn't. And so we try and come up with a reasonable interpretation. And so the language that's provided in the proposed ordinance is that the developer describe what cost reductions result and how those reductions provide for affordable housing costs. Again, you don't have to include this, but it's a change to state law, and I think that you can if you want to.
I think that extra language is helpful.
To explain what reasonable
Yeah,
means. That's how we're
exactly.
interpreting reasonable, two
Exactly.
specific things.
And so that concludes the presentation. Guess I'm not enough. That concludes the actual presentation, but I did want to provide a bulleted list of discussion items to kind of guide the conversation. And I know these are a little bit complex, so I'm hoping that we can kind of break down our conversation and talk about each section separately. So if it pleases the commission. So I'm hoping that we can start with the 90% density requirement and talk about the elimination of the requirement and the provisions that allow for no net loss of units or building out to your maximum allowed units, with the director waiving the no net loss requirement under unusual circumstances.
Okay, well, the only thing that I had is something that I spoke to you about. Oh, excuse me, public comment, I'm sorry.
Yeah, let's do public comment first, and then maybe we can go through the
Okay.
list.
So we have Edward Levin, if you want to come forward.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, members of the Commission, Edward Levin, resident of West Hollywood. I'll start on a positive note. The elimination of the 90% minimum density is terrific as written. You ought to move forward with that item forthwith. Streamlining, honestly, I don't want to get into the CEQA weeds. I would recommend that you set the threshold for commission review at 11 units. That's the point at which our inclusionary housing ordinance triggers on-site affordable unit, which in turn triggers the density bonus. I think it makes more sense to look comprehensively at the ordinance and have this align better with the inclusionary housing ordinance that we have. Now we come to the real problem, which is the height in R2 and R3 and R4. For years, I've argued that we need to update our ordinance to mitigate the height effects of density bonus. This won't do it. It ignores the density bonus waiver, which is being misinterpreted. The treatment of height concession is inconsistent with state law. The staff analysis is based on a misinterpretation of the law. You cannot require justification for financial sufficiency or how this relates to cost reductions. For the past couple of years, I've been working with Assemblymember Richard Bloom's office on housing policy and legislation. In fact, I was directly involved with the 2016 revision to these terms. I know what they mean. I know what they're intended to mean. And that's the idea that we can require financial justification or justification for how this deals with cost is precisely the reason that the term financially sufficient was removed from the state law in the 2016 revision. It was specifically because jurisdictions were misusing that to require such justifications or to allow analysis of improper analyses of the financial justifications. That's why that language is gone. So with all due respect to the city attorney and to our staff, they are not interpreting this statutory language correctly. I was involved in the rewrite. I know what this was about, and it was specifically to prevent this. So I really caution you not to proceed with anything involved with that. We can require documentation, but in the ZTA it adds the clause which includes what cost reductions result. That is not in the statute, and it is not permitted by the statute. In short, there is really no simple way to do this. Under the state density bonus law, height and density are linked. So staff is correct. It's very difficult to do this without dealing with the general plan. We need to address this as a general plan amendment, not simply as a zone text amendment. It won't work. Waivers are being misinterpreted. I have used waivers on projects, and I've had them reviewed by cities, so I seriously, please, let's get serious about doing this right. This is not correct. Thank you.
Commissioner Altschul?
Lauren, would you comment on that, please?
Which piece?
The last piece. The fact that we can't...
Comment, please.
That Mr. Levin thinks that it appears that he's in disagreement with you, that we can ask for the costs and the justification for how the addition of this concession or a specific concession contributes to the affordable housing costs.
I think we just disagree on how the statute is interpreted, because his interpretation would kind of leave the new language with no meaning. What does it mean to be? They specifically added that you can ask for reasonable documentation to establish eligibility to determine that the incentive meets the definition. A definition of an incentive is you reduce development standards to provide for affordable housing costs.
Well, why can't we just use the same language the state uses rather than changing it with our own language?
Well, we did. The only thing we added, because we say provide reasonable documentation establishing the eligibility for concession under state law. What we added is what we think that means is what cost reductions result and how those reductions provide for affordable housing costs. I mean, I suppose you could take it out and leave it to the applicants to
Because what is the difference between financial sufficiency and cost reductions? They're both a calculation, a financial calculation. So if the state specifically removed the language financial self-sufficiency, for us to replace it with cost reductions seems to use just semantics. It's just semantics for the exact same thing.
What the language where they took out financial sufficiency is actually in your findings to deny a concession. And what it now says is you can deny a concession if it does not result in identifiable and actual cost reductions. And that's the same language that's used in the definition for a concession. It has to result in identifiable and actual cost reductions. So my reading is that's all you're asking for. Show us that it results in, that there's a cost reduction so that you meet this definition.
Well, you know, I remember when I went to law school, it was a while ago, very often when legislation is passed, there's also a lot of information about legislative intent that you can read. I haven't done research like that in a while, but is there anything that we could look at with regard to the actual intent that was behind the language that the state used?
I mean, I have looked at it, and I'm sure Mr. Levin's looked at it too. He said that he was involved in the.
Well, can you read what they said about the intent behind that language?
I don't know that it provided much. I can look if you want to keep talking and see what I can find right now.
Anybody else? Question, Stacy?
I don't have my thoughts together.
You don't have your thoughts together, Lynn. Anybody else? Rogerio?
Yep. Is there I know Rachel and I sort of touched on this via email. Is there an advantage, or is there a number, a percentage number that we could lower the 90% to, that would then allow everything to stay in place, but we can actually create some of the variation that we want in the developments?
Look at lowering it instead of eliminating it. Ultimately, the concern became about, no net loss in units in terms of not getting rid of units. I mean, certainly the projects that we've seen that are having trouble redeveloping or developing with the 90% density law have very kind of odd circumstances, and ultimately they may not fit. I know we discussed a potentially going to 75% or 50%. And there's always a scenario where it doesn't really work, and we really wanted to just provide flexibility to people and to allow developers to really determine what works for their site. And frankly, while we absolutely want more units in terms of meeting our housing goals in this city and regionally, we recognize that the ability to have variation in design was important to the community as well, and ultimately felt like the no net loss was a better version than putting a percentage. Absolutely, we could change it to a lower percentage. Recently, you approved or you made a recommendation on the R3CC district, which lowered their requirement to 75%. Ultimately, we will reconcile those when we get to council, because there is 2 ordinances impacting 1 paragraph at the moment that are on slightly different tracks. But that's certainly something we can look at, is doing 75%, 50%. I mean, they are frankly all arbitrary numbers, let's be honest, but we certainly could adjust it.
Did you think about the uniformity of neighborhoods? Like, if we remove the density requirement and someone decides to only develop 3 units on a building and there's 15 and 15 on either side, did anybody think about sort of the contextual impacts of that? Was that discussed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we definitely have variation in number of units throughout multifamily districts. And in a lot of cases, we still have a lot of single family homes that are left amidst, the 15, 20 unit apartment buildings. So ultimately, because we have that variation today, we felt like it could exist. But I truly believe that most projects that you will see will be building buildings that are as large as they can make them work on the site, and that's what we tend to see. I mean, ultimately, as you start whittling down the number of units because of various requirements like open space and parking, you tend to kind of get to your right number for that project. And again, there are some people who may want to build a duplex or a triplex, but they are limited by the maximum average unit size, and that's what tends to propel them into a few extra units.
It makes a lot of sense, and we saw an example earlier today of basically a hardship that a project had in trying to provide the parking by doing the turnstile and doing the lift, and yeah, I get it.
So what was the input from the task force regarding this?
So we didn't have a task force regarding this. We were working on a much larger project initially related to multifamily residential zone districts, and we did propose having a task force, but ultimately the council did not have us move forward with that or our larger contract with our consultant.
Except for, I'm looking at the minutes from the July 17th meeting on this subject, and it was very clear that the direction was that confirming that there was a task force working on this, and there were specific architects and experts in this community that were identified, and because those people had a real experience working in this community and developing projects regarding these density guidelines. And so the council directed us to, staff to, include them in this discussion. And so I would feel that their input would be of considerable value regarding this subject.
Yeah, and we absolutely did want to move forward with the task force. When we went back to council, ultimately they had scaled down the project considerably. We anticipated a multi-year kind of study that would continue on, and they really wanted us to focus on a number of specific tasks. At the July 17th meeting that you're referencing, we actually went back and watched the entire meeting while we were waiting for this item. And I'm not sure where that came from, and I believe it's actually a function of the item after it that's listed, which it's actually listed out of order on the minutes, but I can tell you we watched the entirety of that, that joint meeting with the Community Development Department and the City Council, and the task force for this item was not brought up because they had already eliminated it. They did discuss a task force for the next item, which was green building, and I believe there was some error. But we did absolutely watch the entirety of the video earlier this evening, and I can attest that that was not related to this particular item.
I'm confused because I watched it the other evening as well, and Councilmember Meister specifically referenced, in fact, Mr. Levin and Mr. Abramson, I believe.
Right, and she did that in reference to the green building.
Okay, I'll double check, but okay.
With respect to the 90% requirement, and this is just not an anecdote, one experience I had, there was a lot that, somebody called me about once, and it was not that deep, the size was weird, but you have the 90% requirement, right? So, the project that you had to build on that is not feasible, so you couldn't build anything on it, and there was a single family residence on it surrounded by the taller buildings. But because of that 90% requirement, they couldn't build a duplex. They had to figure out how to build 4 or 5 units on it, and it's just, you couldn't park it. There was no way to make that project feasible. I don't know how many lots like this there are throughout the city, but I understand from a practical standpoint, if you're telling someone you have to build this number of units and it doesn't fit on the site, or just because, let's just say you have a very deep lot that's somewhat narrow, like one of the last item we had was 50 by 150, right? That makes it rough. I don't know. So that's just, I see it from that perspective as well. I think it kind of frees up, and realistically with land prices being so high and this being West Hollywood, I would assume absent, someone as a passion project not maximizing it, they'll build whatever they can build, but I feel like the 90% requirement just ties people's hands. I don't know. I thought.
Okay, Stacy?
I have a couple of just questions and comments. I'm actually fine with the elimination of the 90%. I feel like the maximum average unit size kind of wraps that up nicely. And I think what we don't want, and we don't see it often, as you mentioned, Commissioner Guy, but we don't want people to have to ask for a variance to do less. And I think that's in the spirit of that I think it completely makes sense. I'm fine with that. I have a couple of questions, and I think I mentioned this during our subcommittee meeting as well, but I guess I want to just get better understanding of what we would have a hearing about when it comes to a tract map, because I have been on planning now. I'm heading into going to my 3rd year, and we've never talked about or conditioned a tract map. And I think I understand that legally it needs to be reviewed, but what is the hearing actually going to be about?
So you'd specifically only be talking about the subdivision of land. Essentially, the development permit would have already been administratively reviewed with the condition that the map be reviewed by Planning Commission for per state law. So there are a number of findings in the Subdivision Map Act that you actually are always included in your reports related to the maps, but you typically don't discuss them. So in this case, you really would be talking about, you know, is the site and neighborhood sufficient to, kind of absorb those units essentially, and the number of units on the site, and that's. It is very, very limiting, but we don't have a choice.
Well, it would
as to
already be
whether to go
decided
ahead.
by the director. They would have already decided that it's okay to move forward on that number of units. So
But
what
the
are we
dir-
going to do? Nothing.
I mean, it makes me a little uncomfortable just from a public perception standpoint, that they would be reviewed separately.
Can I ask a question along the lines of just
Sure,
getting
sure.
some clarity from the city attorney? When someone comes in for a subdivision tract map, per the Subdivision Map Act, is a discretionary approval at the city level required? Like, i.e., is it required that it has to be reviewed by a body like ours?
Yes.
So effectively, the reason we need to parse it out is because it needs to be heard by us, per state law.
Right, the tract map can't be approved at the
But
administrative
the
level.
change that's being proposed is to help streamline, and that's the part I'm not comfortable with. I'm not disagreeing with the legal need to hear the tract map. I'm questioning how it makes us look as a city and as a community to not hear these kinds of projects. That's where my comfort level is. That's where I'm not okay with that.
I agree with you. When I was reading this, I had a lot of issues with the number of projects that are going to be reviewed by the director at staff level. And I think that the issue for me is transparency and the proper notice to the community about what's happening in their neighborhoods. You're making it so that fewer projects, I understand the idea of streamlining is so that it doesn't take as long to go through it, but what you're sacrificing is the transparency and the opportunity for neighbors to weigh in on these projects. And I think that the changes in the regulations with regard to the number of units and so forth, I think it's a big leap from where we are now to where you want to go. And I just would like to make a little bit of a change there. I just think we're putting ourselves in a situation where we're going to get a lot of pushback, I think, by the community, and I'm uncomfortable with it, frankly.
I'm sorry, I have more comments. I don't want to shut anybody down, but.
Go on.
I have questions about the way that we are splitting up the concessions, because in my mind, we have some very smart developers in this town. And I feel like there are always going to be unforeseen consequences of the changes that we make, which is why I want to dig in on this a little bit. A concession is a concession is a concession. So whether it's highlighted on a list or not, to me seems arbitrary. I mean, but legally, could we, I understand some of the conversation around like showing that they're eligible for the concession, but they're gonna build what they can build, and I feel like we can put it wherever we want, but keeping it off of the main menu, if you will, is not going to prevent people from asking for it or legally being entitled to it by law, right? I mean, I just want to make sure that I have a fundamental understanding of the law, because the law is necessarily vague, and the law's purpose is not to be efficient. It is to be fair, which is kind of laughable. It's to give everybody kind of due process. But I just don't, I just kind of feel like it says, we say we're going to do this, but I don't know that I feel like it's actually going to do anything. And it's not that I disagree with the intent or the spirit of it. I completely understand that. But I'm hesitant to move this part of this. I actually don't support moving this part of it forward, because I'm wishy-washy about the legal implications of it. there is going to be a legal way for a developer to get the height that they want. And I don't know that I feel like this addresses that. The only other thing that I wanted to say was, if we do decide to change this, was in regard to the 11-unit minimum for condos. I actually think that's, I am in agreement with Mr. Levin's comment about that. Those are my comments. I'm definitely open to discussion on those, but I feel 90% I'm completely okay with. The other two things I feel like we need to like really get in the weeds on.
Excuse me.
I just
Ms.
wanted to
Johnson.
clarify as well regarding the subdivision requirements, that you review all subdivisions. Essentially, the Subdivision Map Act is really related to, large subdivisions where you're splitting up thousands of acres into single-family homes, and really is pretty silent on condo maps, yet, and it doesn't differentiate the two. So that's kind of where they're coming from in terms of why the state requires that you review these maps. A lot of cities just have condo maps, but in other communities in California, you see kind of major subdivisions that we will never really see here. And that's kind of part of the rationale from the state side.
Mr. Altshuler.
I think a lot of this is like Sue and Stacy pointed out, the crass phrase for it is for public show, but I think there's a reality there where people can come and complain about the fact that their views are being taken away, that their light and shade and shadow is going to be affected, whether it will or it won't. But basically, it's worse in New York, where they don't have setbacks like we do, and where the wall of a building that I know a friend lives in on 54th Street backs up within inches of a wall on a building on 55th Street. People here don't know what that's like with respect to light. I know some people that live in those buildings that never lift their shades or open their blinds, because what's the use? But here, we give that forum for venting, for airing, and for education. And again, it's sort of like the wedding, where the officiant always, or used to say, if there's anybody that objects to this, please step forward and tell us now. I don't know if that's done anymore, but if it is, it's probably just ceremonial and just probably kind of reminiscent. But here, some kind of reminiscent is, as Sue pointed out, important. And I agree that putting the concession, calling it a concession instead of a bonus or an incentive, and taking it off as they said, the main menu, doesn't really do anything, except put it into the area where we have the right to question the finances of it. And that is one reason why in a recent project, we got to tell people to go back and do it over again, because we have the right to question on the menu. We have a right to question the individual elements of the finances of it that lead to question mark what? Well, the only thing it can lead to is the justification for the affordable housing and the justification for our requirements of affordable housing, which are somewhat stringent. So I think what the staff has come up with is extremely okay with respect to leading up to that. And I agree that if you get to ask what your costs are, it has to lead to an explanation of what those costs do. So I think it's certainly worth trying, because I think it's appropriate, and I think it's vital.
So my thoughts, I like getting rid of the 90%, just going through your list here, or the no net loss. I have some concerns about just lowering that number. The property I live on is like 6,500 square feet, but there are 8 units there. So if we did a lower number, they could actually build, if they were to ever replace it, which they could never build the 8, but we would actually lose a lot more by doing a lower percentage, I believe, than doing the no net loss. So I like that approach. I want to clarify, in the staff report, it says that one commissioner at the subcommittee suggested that the director be allowed to waive parking instead of the no net loss. And that came from a comment I made, but isn't really what I was trying to relay. And what I was trying to relay is that I think that the no net loss should be the last resort, as opposed to looking at other options. Again, the building I live in has 2 parking spots for 8 units. If they needed a reduction in units, it might be worth having a community conversation about not parking it sufficiently, because it really would actually impact the neighborhood less and we wouldn't lose as many units. I'm not saying that's what we should do. No one should misinterpret my comments, but I believe that community conversation, rather than just simply waiving the no net loss, that's my only concern.
Is there another way that you would like it to be reflected? Rather than director can waive no net loss requirement, that...
Well, I had asked
that
staff...
if there's a net loss, that there be some way to address that?
I think that there should be other options on the table besides just that being the option for the director. Maybe there had to be a community conversation, a director's hearing or something. I don't know how that looks. I had asked staff to kind of come back with that, and I don't see that, but that's a hang up for me. And I wanted to just clarify the staff report because it didn't really encapsulate what I wanted. And I'd be interested in hearing if staff has some recommendations on that, but I want to go through the rest of these, so I keep my train of thought really quickly. And that is on the track map. Having worked at Los Angeles City Hall and been a council person's representative in the community on developments, as well as being the person on that other side of the podium for the last few years for you folks, I don't want to insult the residents of West Hollywood. We have a very educated community, but most people don't pay attention to what we do. And they get a notice in the mail that says there's going to be a hearing about this development, and that's all they understand. And if it says track map and it has the language in there specifying it's just about the track map, again, I don't want to insult residents, but I don't think they're going to pay attention to that. I think they're going to come here and say, don't build this building. Don't tear down my trees. Don't build so close to my property line. And we're going to say, that's already been decided, and right now, we tell folks, sorry, we can't protect your view. Imagine how angry they're going to be at the city if we say, not only can't we do anything about it, but it's already been decided before you even got here. So, yes, I would love if staff could just approve a track map for a 2-unit condo building. Like, I don't think that should come here under most circumstances. But because the state requires us to see the track map, I think we have to also see the development process. So I wish we could push that off, but I just don't believe in dividing those, and that's a hurdle too far for me. Otherwise, though, reviewing the streamlining that review authority, I tend to agree to. I like the idea of reducing it to 11, but I like that a lot of stuff will be able to be approved at the staff level, and I think we should move forward with that in some form. That's where I'm at on these things.
So just in response to your comment about the deviation from other standards, I mean, certainly there are a number of other ways to deviate from standards before we would look at that net loss and the unusual circumstances. We can be more specific about that language too. Tends to be the kind of beyond a hardship scenario. We do have variances and modifications that can be requested, and ultimately staff really wanted to keep those in that realm so that you are reviewing those things, we would ultimately want people to go down that avenue before we looked at just kind of waiving the no net loss requirement, because ultimately that's something that we feel really strongly about, making sure people are building units. Some of the examples that we've seen are projects where the water table is extraordinarily high, for example, and they can't really dig at all. You can dig, and you can spend a lot of money pumping water all day. So technically, it is not as much of a hardship on the variance level as one might think, and we do have a very high threshold for variances, particularly in this city. So that's why we did have the unusual circumstances that didn't quite fit into the variance or modification, but we would certainly direct people to all of their available options before the director would just go ahead and waive that. It's certainly not something that would be done callously. I did just want to add one other item in response to what you're saying about the splitting up of the development permit and the subdivision of the property. And the reality of what we do see, unfortunately, not too often, but it does happen, is that we have an application for an apartment building, and during and that's something that could potentially be administratively reviewed, and we see the applicant themselves piecemealing their own project and coming back to us later with that condo map in order to kind of create this system for themselves. So it's already happening in some cases, unfortunately, and the reality is that, yes, it is unfortunate for people to come and not be able to make an impact on the project, but I think it's the key piece here is extreme educational component with the community, both for, these ZTAs and any, zone text amendments that we have in the city. And we really need to make sure, and this is, our goal at the end of this, whatever form that this ends up being approved in, is that we go out to the community and explain to them how things are changing and really give them clear expectations of how they can get involved, how they can provide public comment. And when I reviewed kind of the process and where people can kind of give their input, we want to really drive home that people have the ability to provide that same input at a community meeting, or by writing a letter, or by coming in, or by meeting with the developer directly. And we very often facilitate those meetings, which are actually, frankly, possibly the most successful of the conversations, because they just have the one-on-one and can really get the issues out on the table. So I think, whatever the result is of all these zone text amendments, we'll really need to help the community understand not only where they can provide input, but how things are changing, so that they have clear expectations. And ultimately, for us, it was really trying to push not only streamlining the development review process, but we felt strongly about incentivizing smaller buildings for people. So that if they did want to build smaller, which tends to be less impactful, that they would be able to do so administratively.
And I think that if somebody's going to come in later with a track map, that's really unfortunate and it's disingenuous. And the community we can be very clear and point to the developer and say they're the one who did this. But I just, again, so you all know where I stand, it's a hurdle too far for me on that one.
So, Chair, concerns me for the public, the way of perception.
Lynn.
Excuse me, Lynn?
So I too would say that the 90% density requirement needed to go away quite some time ago, and I think we seem to be all in agreement on that. However, on the other two items, I have a number of concerns. In particular, I think that I agree entirely with Commissioner Bass and Jones about the separation of the track map, and the three of us were on long-range planning when this was discussed, and I think we were unanimous in our comments exactly along those lines at that meeting. And in fact, we addressed back to the issue of transparency, and there's something to be said about a deliberative body that is hearing from the community. The opportunity exists for us to elevate the process and come up with better ideas, as opposed to a more insular staff process that doesn't encourage that conversation. And I think we've got enough issues as it is with perceptions in this town that it would behoove us to keep the perception of transparency transparent. So in addition to that, I think that this, and I've gone to number 3 here, I've skipped over number 2 for the moment, that there's a number of components to this staff recommendation that would, I think, enhance it, such as improved noticing. And as you just mentioned, Rachel, that communication obviously would be a key component to any changes you made to something like this, but that noticing would be a very critical piece of that. And perhaps when you come back with something like this, if you redo it, you look at tiered noticing, depending upon the size of the project, which might even escalate the noticing for the super large projects so that it's an even bigger radius, whereas smaller projects, maybe it's a smaller radius. I mean, I think there's a whole component to this review authority conversation that It's not just about who gets to approve it, but how do we improve the process? Having said that, I spoke with Councilmember Meister last night because she is the one who actually, said in this July 17th minutes that I handed out earlier, she's the one who said, let's look at how we can expedite the process. And when I spoke to her last night and asked her, what were her feelings on the subject, and she said that her idea was for it to be done for smaller projects only, okay? Now, obviously, she's just one of the council members, but this was her recommendation and her suggestion. And so, consistent with the recent approval from council to expedite the process on smaller commercial projects, her idea was that this would be consistent with the smaller residential projects. It wasn't necessarily expediting this process for the very large projects. In particular, if you really were to look at our agendas over the past 6 months since I've been a commissioner, I think of only one project that we would be reviewing under this schema that's been through our, can you think of anything else? I think it's only La Cienega that would have even come through this body in the last 6 months. So back to the transparency issue. And the other thing that's missing from this is that her idea and recommendation, and again consistent with the commercial one, was that the expedited process would mean that there were no bonuses, no incentives, no variances, nothing, no changes from what was exactly in the code in order for the expedited process. So that was what her comments were to me when I spoke to her about it. And back to her second comment was that perhaps we wait until we see how the expedited commercial process works, rolls out, the resulting projects, the dialogue in the community, before we try and then institute a similar thing in the residential component. So I would agree with Commissioners Jones and Bass that on the review authority, that this needs some more work. This needs to be fleshed out a little bit more, and we really need to think about our transparency in the community. On the height concessions, I think it's a similar issue. I think that this is a very complex issue. It's obviously one of the biggest hot points in our city. If you look at the study that we were sort of shown at long-range planning, there's a huge component here in height from the community that needs to be addressed. This is absolutely a hot button, and it should be addressed. But again, I don't think this is ready. That we need to be addressing things in a much more complex and robust manner, including height averaging, including a lot of things that all affect height. It's not just sort of a one-off thing. And with that said, I would like to move that we approve staff's recommendation on the 90% density requirement, but that we ask staff to revisit the Height and Development Review Authority proposals and, based upon all of the comments heard here today, and consider, especially in the height component, including that task force component and addressing it with the some of the experts in our community that council identified.
No.
Okay, second the motion.
Comment, but I'm not gonna second.
Do you want to make your comment first before the second, so that we can...
No, I'll make it, there is a second.
Okay,
I'll
but
make my
when we have
comment.
a motion on the table, then we can only address the motion, not other comments that might not be directly related.
I want to address the motion.
Okay, thank you.
And my thought on the motion is the entire council, not just Councilmember Meister, requested that these three items be studied by the staff and brought forward. The fact that it doesn't somehow doesn't appear acceptable to bring it all forward, or that one council person wants to have it studied longer and longer and longer, doesn't mean it shouldn't be brought forward. It's been requested to be brought forward. If the council or a majority of it wanted it not to be, or wanted it to be really thoroughly studied to an extent that it hasn't been, and I'm sure they're all aware to the extent that it is being studied now, the majority should just say so. So I think it's our duty to give our thoughts as individuals and as a commission as to what the staff has brought forward and how we recommend yes or no, and in what proportions on these items that are here.
Commissioner Bass.
I would like to speak on the motion, and that is, I can't support the motion because I don't believe we have the authority to direct something to a task force. I think that's only staff, because we have no budgetary authority here, and that would be a big budget issue. So for that reason, I can't support the motion for that. I also believe we could
Then
probably...
I'd happily amend the motion to address that. That's not a problem.
I also would prefer, the other thing is that we divide basically those three buckets, because I believe there's a lot of support for the first one, and we could get to a really strong recommendation. I believe that we're hearing a little bit of consensus on the third section, and I think we could probably come up with a recommendation which includes recommending council that they not do certain things. So I just think we could break it up more. So I like where you're going with this, but I don't think this is it.
Okay, so
And I also think the recommendation could also include so many commission members voted in one way and so many voted another way, and this one said continue it.
Right.
It's the entire thing, but that's the recommendation. And I
But
think,
so
I believe the majority of the council wants to hear the staff's work product on
We
this.
break it up into 3 votes?
But we have a motion before the floor, so we have to vote on this motion. I'll call the question on this motion.
Well, can I get some clarification in case it passes? For purposes of a resolution tonight, it would only be recommending section 1, and sections 2, 3, 4, and 5 would be tabled for further discussion.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And the motion fails, 2 ayes and 5 noes.
So can we break it up into 3 or however many sections are required and go item by item like a
Yeah,
straw
Rachel,
vote?
do you want to put your discussion items
Well,
back
we
up?
could
Maybe
make
we
a
should-
motion, somebody could move that and take one at a time.
Well, I think what Commissioner Altshuler was saying is actually probably our best bet here is to, in terms of like passing a resolution that I hope all can feel comfortable with, is commenting on all of the individual items that are enumerated in the item and make our recommendations as regard those in a motion, rather than breaking them up to vote on them separately, if everybody is okay with that.
Do you want to walk through each section of the resolution and see where there might be consensus?
Right.
Would that, just before you make a motion, just sort of
Right,
take a
right,
straw
right.
poll?
I'm not necessarily saying I would make it, but I think it's, if folks are in agreement that that's something that we could move forward with, like, we can move it to council with recommendations regarding what we should and should not do.
I would agree, and this is in time for commissioners' comments, but in the future, things that are this disparate, submitting them as separate ZTAs would make this a bit more administratively
Easier for artists.
easier for everybody. So that would be a suggestion.
Okay, so do we want to go down section by section and see if there's consensus?
Yeah, it sounds like, if I'm not mistaken, we have pretty sweeping agreement as regards the 90% minimum density elimination regime. As proposed.
Right, but what about the no net loss units? Are you separating that out and all that?
Well,
The
again,
directive-
I'm like, we're bringing them up point by point.
Okay.
So Commissioner Bass, did you want to speak to that part of it, the no net loss of units?
I support that. The issue I had was the director can waive no net loss requirement, but my understanding from staff is that that would be a last resort if variances and those other options were not possible.
But then it should be more specific about that, I think, because I'm also in agreement with you. That I have a concern about
So
the director's waiver and it just being so out there like that.
I would be more comfortable with this without that last portion of the director can waive no net loss, because perhaps that's something that should come here if we reduce lots.
I would agree.
But not the sword I'm going to die on tonight, but that's where I'm at.
So can we make a motion?
You want to take a straw poll first,
Let's take a
maybe?
straw poll, and then we'll make
we'll-
one sweeping motion.
Okay.
The motion would be supporting the 90%, the elimination of the 90%.
No net
However,
loss.
With
holding recommendation on the director waiving no net loss.
with the
Supporting
removal of
first
the last
three-
sentence in this paragraph in section
last
1.
sentence.
The last new paragraph, the last new sentence, correct? There's one sentence at the very end.
Right.
Correct, the last new sentence.
I'll
How
just
many of
clarify,
you
we're
would-
going to bring this resolution back. We're not going to try and make these changes on the spot, so we can
Okay, but
do what we
would
need to do.
How many of you would agree to support the first three components under this 90% distance and just eliminate the last one?
We're talking about section 1
Yeah, section 1.
as amended with the exception of the last new sentence.
Right.
I agree.
Yeah, same.
So the majority.
Majority would
And then it
approve
would-
that.
Then we should also point out the, what is it, 2 that did not support that, and ask them if they would care to comment.
Who didn't
and
support
include
it?
their comment.
Who didn't support it?
Only Rogerio was the only one that didn't.
Would you care to comment?
Right, so it's everybody but Rogerio.
6 and 1, okay.
Yeah, would you like to tell
Oh,
us
we-
what you're thinking? I'd
If
like
we
to
remove
hear.
the director can waive no net loss requirement, I'm still not convinced a lower percentage couldn't fulfill a lot of what we're trying to do.
Okay.
So, I mean, it'll pass, but I'm not convinced
So
that
he's
that lowering
explained,
the percentage.
he's explained his reason for voting no, which should be, I believe, enumerated in the long explanation of the recommendation.
So that council knows
Yes,
what we're all thinking.
okay.
Okay,
Height concessions.
let's move on to the height concessions. Comments?
Maybe we'll just go in order and then get everybody's comments. It'll be faster.
Section 2, I, at this time, would vote no.
David?
And I believe that,
Um,
oh, I'm sorry.
I was thinking we go in order.
Just go down the row.
I believe that the other concessions, to the extent that we know what they are, should be enumerated and stated, even if you want to push them down to the bottom of the page. But I don't think you should try to sweep them off the page or under the rug because they're there. I also think that the situation where you can require the documentation and the information on the finances is certainly enough under the current state law to let you have a discussion on whether or not the finances justify the reduction of costs for the affordable housing.
I would agree with Commissioner Alchel.
So you're saying they just leave the language that the state has and not try to clarify it?
Yes.
I agree. Can we
So
take a
who all agrees?
straw vote on that?
Straw vote.
We agree?
We'll just take out this.
3,
Period
4,
after state law.
5, 6.
So 6.
And I see a dissenting comment. Would you like to express why so that council know?
I actually support this staff recommendation.
Okay, so that's,
That was, sorry, we were
I
talking.
was pushing the concession, like for instance, the additional 5th story.
To the
down
bottom
to
of the
other
list.
and
That was
not
a yes or a
enumerating,
no?
just-
Commissioner Bass said that he's supporting the staff recommendation, whereas other commissioners didn't feel that that should go to the bottom of the list so that you could pretend it's not there, and hopefully nobody will see it.
Okay, so it was,
And that it should be, he thinks it should not be enumerated, as I gather.
I support staff's recommendation as written. That's ultimately.
As written.
Yep.
but everyone else wants to keep the
Well,
A as it is.
that the concessions list should be more straightforward, I think. not trying to hide the height thing to the bottom of some list because we're trying to change that. We don't want to encourage people to do the height. So, but it is there. All the concessions are there. Anybody could use whatever one depending on how they want to build their project. But to just sort of push it down the list so somebody maybe new to our community doesn't
To push it down the list doesn't actually achieve the
doesn't
goal
achieve
of
anything.
addressing the height issue.
Yeah.
Just, as was used, I think Stacy said, our developers aren't stupid. They're going to
Right.
figure out where it is. It'll take them about 30 seconds. So to just shift it around on the page, I don't see that it actually achieves the goal of, addressing the
Right.
height issues that everybody in our community has expressed in this focus group, et cetera. So,
We can't legally tell people what they can or cannot request as a concession, right?
They can ask for
So I
any
just think that
concession they
it,
want.
that,
it's state law.
So,
So the consensus is to keep A the way it is, and on the end paragraph, end after state law, and take out the explanation. That
I
the-
would disagree as that's the consensus. My personal opinion is that this needs to be, to address the actual issue, which is height. And that these modifications don't specifically address the issue that was directed by City Council, which is to address the concerns of the community about height. So it might do some nominal things, but I think as a whole, it's just a minor Band-Aid.
Did you study or look at the fact that in addition to the state's list of concessions, the city has a list of incentives? That if the height issue be looked at by adjusting the city's incentives and leaving the state's concessions in place, we might achieve what we're looking to achieve?
So concessions and incentives here are the same, and they're interchangeable in the
Yes,
state
they
law.
are.
So
But
we list,
the city tends to call them incentives, and the state tends to call them concessions.
right, so we have some specific listings that were shown that were, for example, 10% reduction in minimum rear yard setback. Just using that as an example, the state is silent on a percentage. The state just talks about the development standards and lists a non-exhaustive list of what those standards could be: setbacks, open space, height, et cetera. So we get into the details about how we would like people to request a concession, but certainly that doesn't limit them to those things because of
But
the
if
other.
we end up deciding, or if the council ends up deciding they would rather have a cap of 4 stories and not the opportunity for 5, have we looked at adjusting our incentives rather than trying to play with the state's concessions?
I don't believe we can.
We can what?
I don't believe we can't cap
Reduce it.
something and limit their ability to ask for additional height through the state density bonus law should they utilize
That's what I'm
that.
saying.
Yeah.
If we try to cut the height down by looking at our own incentives so that we don't compile an incentive on top of a concession, which is what's happening.
that's what's happening.
If we clean up our own,
We need to clean up our own incentives.
rather than
Maybe.
try to,
Right, so that was the goal here, to eliminate the kind of broadcasting of the extra story. Again, they can ask for a multitude of things, but am I not understanding your question? I'm sorry.
my question is, if we adjust the
mixed
language
use.
of the city's
oh.
incentive,
Are you referring to the mixed-use height incentive? Because that's a city-only permissive height incentive.
there are certain circumstances, as I recall, that the city on residential properties allows an incentive of additional height.
So we eliminated the green building incentives already that allowed that extra height, and there are no other city incentives in residential zones for extra height. So the only way to get taller than the current zoning requirements is through the state density bonus. In residential zones.
What about saying that?
in residential zones.
In any case where the applicant requests a concession under the state law, they are not entitled to any incentives under the city's zoning code.
Any height incentive under the cities.
Right, and so we don't have any that exist for residential projects. that this would
Only
apply
in the
to.
only in the mixed use
The mixed use
zone, and that
and green.
the green has been eliminated recently from the code.
Green was eliminated.
Recently.
So in mixed use, if we say, if they decide to adopt a state concession, we're not offering any incentives.
Yes. 2 points on that. The city council is going to be having a discussion topic on the mixed-use incentive program, I think in December. That would require a general plan amendment. It's not impossible, but to get rid of the mixed-use incentive, to be able to combine that with the density bonus, it's in our general plan, so it would have to be changed from the general plan too. But it's,
So
excuse me?
if we wish to recommend this to the council, that they make the incentives conform to the concession laws and give priority to the concessions over the incentives in mixed use, this would be the time to do it, since they're going to study it next month.
Yeah.
So we're not, the ordinance before you is about residential zoning, not commercial mixed-use zoning. So let's make sure, so there aren't any other incentives in a residential zone that are city incentives. So what we were talking about were mixed-use incentives, which is commercial zones like buildings on Santa Monica Boulevard, not on residential streets.
So on the attachment A, where you're changing the language on this, the available concessions, it looks like you're crossing off the additional story completely, and there's no attention to it, and that's what you're intending to do, so that you can just hide it, that it's not really an incentive that they're entitled to?
So no, we're
It
not.
doesn't, but
so
the
that- so-
other doesn't say what the others are.
So the point of what we were trying to do was to try to try to incentivize people to build smaller buildings by having the provision that streamlines projects. So you can have a staff-approved project, but you can only have a staff-approved project if you don't use the height bonus. And so those two provisions go together to try to provide an incentive for a developer to choose to build a smaller building. It's
So-
not that the height concession goes away, it's just put in a different category that requires a public hearing.
And
So
how many are in that category?
it's an unlimited number, it's whatever a developer comes up with. And so the idea was,
Developer gets to create his own incentives or
yes, and they can do that right now. And we have very creative developers in this city, and they have created numerous,
But the development community already is aware of the so-called concession for the bonus story.
right, so it's not.
We may as well
Well,
put
say
it in
it.
print.
So that's perfectly fine. We can certainly say it, but the intent was, how can we make it easier or more likely that some, not all, some developers might build smaller buildings? And by saying we can approve some projects at a staff level,
Right.
and projects without that extra floor, some developers would make that choice of building a smaller building. It's not going to impact everybody. We fully understand that. This is just another option that a developer would then take into consideration, in their calculations. Do I feel it's worth my while to build a smaller building with a staff approval that's only 3 stories or 4 stories, depending on the zone? Or do I just want to go ahead and go through a full public hearing and get the full building? It's just to provide another option for some developers who might want to choose that path.
Both of them.
So if I can, and I think this is how I understood it before, but I want to just reiterate it, and I think I'm going to literally say what you just said, but, what we are doing is creating an avenue through which developer X can walk in and build a project that's by right? They have this list of available concessions, and then they have the quote-unquote other concessions. If they go for the available concessions, and they don't go for the extra floor, which happens to be on the other list, they get to avoid coming before us. Alternatively, if they decide to go for the other concessions, which the extra floor is one of them, then they're subject to full planning commission review. Now, as someone who is in this industry, and who's aware of, and I hope I'm not going to offend anybody in this room, but who's aware of this city's reputation when it comes to development. A lot of we have very creative developers who understand the process here, and it's kind of the same cast of characters with a few variations, right? Because they get it. But a lot of people don't come to this city because of this very reason. So if we open up this avenue, we very well might see projects that don't go for that extra floor because developer Y now is going to say, great, I can do this over the counter. Screw the extra floor, excuse my language. I don't need it. I'll just do this. And then you might end up seeing 3- and 4-story projects. So I see what you guys are getting at, and I actually understand it and support it. So I support the staff recommendation.
I support it as a goal, but I don't see how this exactly achieves it. I still have concerns.
I think, and again, this is just me talking out loud, right, for the purposes of discussion. If you tell a developer, listen, you can do this over the counter, the planning process, and then you guys stop me or correct me if I'm wrong, please. But, you can do this over the counter, you get your architect and your, landscape designer, and you go through the planning process, your cost will be, what's that? Okay. Your cost will be X, right? Now, if this turns into, for instance, if I'm going to go for the extra floor, I'm going to get, let's just say, a project that was, let's just say, hypothetically 11 units, now including your affordable units and whatnot goes to 15. Now, I have to sit down and do the calculation of, do I want to go before planning commission? Do I want to spend money on, expediters and so on and so forth, and then come and then roll the dice here, be sent back several times, which happens with us semi-frequently. So you're a developer, you're sitting there, and it's like you're in Vegas. It's like, do I take the even money, or do I roll the dice, or do I keep going? And I think that's actually a pretty good way to incentivize developers to keep height lower. Did I say, am I missing any of that here?
Yeah, right. That's what we were thinking, yes.
And I understand the logic of
Right.
it, but being in the financial world and doing this kind of math, most developers consistently will always go for the biggest and most amount that they can put on that property, period, amen, end of conversation.
I
And it's going to have
respectfully
to take a really onerous 2-year-long process that's going to cost you, your monthly mortgage and your et cetera, et cetera. Yes, it's a math. Yes, I agree with you 100% that it's math, but I don't believe that our process is that onerous that the math isn't going to play out to every time still go for the biggest build.
And I say this totally respectfully, I disagree. I think, if you tell someone that, listen, you get to go through planning, and assuming you design it correctly and you design it to code, there's a light at the end of the tunnel versus I might be in this process for 12 to 18 months, maybe more. That's, especially with carrying costs and the finances that you described, I actually get this. I get it 100%. I'm sorry.
I think the bigger
Just also,
question.
2 of the projects tonight didn't use the density bonus, so people are choosing not to utilize all of those incentives. So there were projects tonight that didn't utilize, yeah.
My concern is the bigger question, which was called by our community member, Mr. Levin, which is whether or not we can legally give preference to certain concessions over others. And that's where I am on the line. I completely understand what you're saying, and I understand the intent of it. But my question is, by law, can we tell a developer, you can have these concessions, and there's other concessions, and you have to come to Planning Commission for these, and you don't have to for these? That's the part that I don't feel comfortable with.
Can we do that, City Attorney?
Yeah, so our city attorney has reviewed this project, this application, and they have a lot of knowledge in land use law, and that's their recommendation, that they believe that we can.
And I don't normally like to turn to other cities, but I believe Santa Monica does this too. I think there are other cities that have programs in place for different types of review authorities for different types of projects. The state law doesn't talk about this. This is very nuanced to our city and our code. The state law is intended to encourage affordable housing. And so we don't want to do things that discourage affordable housing. That is what, that's the thing. We do have an inclusionary ordinance, so we mandate affordable housing. So on the one hand, we we require it.
And I don't think
But they can pay an in lieu fee and they don't have
They
to
can
put it
pay
in
an
there.
in lieu fee and not put it in, and then we get the units in another way.
Yes, and I don't think some developers avoid coming here because it takes 6 months or 4 months longer through the planning process. I think they don't come here for other reasons. I think they don't come here because we have very strict affordable housing laws. I think they don't come here because we have very strict rent stabilization laws. But I think the months it takes to get through the process is not an untoward concern.
Could we make findings that some concessions had more of a community impact, more of a community impact than others, and that's why they're held to a different standard? Would that be helpful? Would that, I mean, because from what I understand, the community is most angry usually about height over any of these others. And so that's what we're hearing from the community, so maybe that's why it's held to a different standard. I don't know if that helps get us past the having different categories.
Like a concession is a concession, and I just, I'm not a legal expert, but I don't know. I just feel like we're kind of like taking it one place and putting it in another.
And that's exactly right. We are taking it one place and putting it in other for the purposes of streamlining some projects. And the ones who use the height bonus would do the very same process they have now. So it'd be no change for people who do the height bonus. Everything stays exactly the same. If you choose not to do it, then the way this was put together, it would then be streamlined.
I just want to say one other thing. For the other concessions provide more public input. They're asking for something that's different and unusual. It doesn't change the city's ability to deny them. The findings for denying a concession come from state law, and they are very strict. So whether a project comes before you or is approved at the staff level, the findings are the same. So that, we're not changing that. We're essentially just saying there's more public input for concessions that are in G, or it would be F under the new proposal, than other concessions potentially.
Yes, but I think that with the other category, we at least need to name the extra story as a possibility rather
In the
than
other
try
category.
to sweep it under the rug.
Yeah. Like, why not move A, an additional story not to exceed 10 feet of total project height, into G, or wherever's the bottom, and other regulatory concessions that are identifiable, financially sufficient or something. Just move it to the bottom of the list, so it's not the first thing that they see and say, oh, that's what we're going for. They'll look at the other possibilities, and then,
I think that's an important point, because this wasn't just about hiding height. It's about highlighting other priorities. Look at setbacks. Look at other things that might reduce your costs.
Because people do look at the first thing, and that's like starts to get their mindset. There's no question about that.
Not a savvy developer or a lobbyist. If A is G and G becomes H, they're going to find it.
Well, it's all there,
Because
but it should be
A
named.
compared to B, the two are ridiculous. A 10% reduction well, not the rear yard setback, but a 10% reduction into private open space is nothing compared to an additional story.
That's certainly something that we could change.
Yeah, and, you can certainly make a recommendation, and we can forward this on to City Council as one of the options, that the Planning Commission is providing.
I also have like the number of units that set apart what comes to commission and can be staff review. I think that we're, again, like I said earlier in the hearing, that we're jumping from 4 or fewer units to 6 or fewer units, and 8 to 12. I think it's a big leap, and I think that we're going to not have, putting more things at staff level, and the community is not going to be giving us the input. And I think that the larger the development, whether it's 4 units or 6 units or 8 units or 12 units, is a big difference in our community. So that's my thought.
Can we actually just go back to section 2? I really appreciate those thoughts, and I think it'll help us moving forward, but I'm still looking for kind of a straw poll here on what you'd like to do on section 2. I heard a number of things of just, you know, I had two against kind of section 2 as a whole and 2 for it, and then we kind of shifted to potentially moving an additional story not to exceed 10 feet of total project height at the beginning of other regulatory concessions.
Okay, so would you put that other screen back up?
So I have an idea. Why don't, could you go through those 3 options again and we'll just raise our hands? Is that cool, Rachel?
Yep, because we're bringing back a resolution next
Perfect.
time, so we're just getting some direction.
So option 1,
on what that
Why don't we start with option 1 as written?
as written.
Is that okay? Okay.
Where's that?
Where is
They're
that?
saying them, they're not written. She's stating them. The options, correct?
Yeah, as I've heard various versions. So then option 2 for section 2 would be to, let's go with the opposite, to keep it as the language as is written today. Okay, and then option 3 was move an additional story not.
There's 2?
2? Okay.
Okay.
And then the third option,
Can I just make a minor adjustment, maybe, and ask Stacy if she would agree? We still have the financially sufficient language in here that we have to get rid of by state law.
That we're gonna.
Right, I mean, that's
take
a change, but yeah, I would vote to keep the language as is, not as it's written here.
and then a third hybrid option would be to move an additional story not to exceed 10 feet of total project height to a new letter F, which would then read an additional story not to exceed 10 feet of total project height or other regulatory concessions that result in identifiable and actual cost reductions to provide for affordable housing costs or the rents or for the affordable units as specified in Government Code Section 65915. And I kept the last sentence out.
And the last sentence comes out.
Did we want to, that was kind of we'll have one more option then, I guess, potentially.
All right.
That sounds good.
That's the one I'm going for.
I'd give you half a vote on that one.
So no one likes any of those options. So where do we go from here? Do we have new options? I guess a fourth option is moving the first sentence to the end and keeping all of the language as written for the rest of what is subsection F.
Not my preference, but I could go for that.
She's just her notes.
I mean, we could document that some people don't have an opinion.
I would love for you all to have an opinion one way or another, though.
I
So we can
think-
at least get a recommendation.
I would like to suggest that staff, given all of the conversation that we have, go back, think about it, look at it, really look at the intent and see and what the implications of the various permutations are, and bring it back.
My understanding was that we were going to go through, though, and
Adam, what are you thinking?
get some
I'm looking at you
consensus
because
here.
you look very like you were really thinking.
No, I just,
You look like a thinker.
thank you. I'll take the compliment. I look like a thinker. I like it how it is. If we spell out the height at the end, but keep it all the same otherwise, to me, that's semantics. I'm fine with that. I also agree that any developer is going to know they can get the height. So whether we say it or not, they're going to know it. So I don't care if we say it or we don't say it. I like asking for the financial information if we can do that legally. If we can do it legally, then I like doing that. If we can't do it legally, then obviously let's pull it out. So I'll wait for staff's staff to review the legislative
I
intent.
agree
I think that
I'd
the
like
chair
to
asked
know
for.
the legislative intent on that.
Yeah, I looked it up sitting here. It's not terribly helpful. One thing I wanted to say about that sentence is that doesn't need to hold this up because we're actually bringing back other revisions to Chapter 1922 in January for other changes in state law. So that sentence doesn't need to hold up these policy planning decisions because that's more of a technical piece. So why don't we leave it at that? I'm happy to talk to Mr. Levin more. I've consulted with other affordable housing experts in the state who completely agree with this position. I'm interested in hearing from
I
Mr.
mean, with
Levin
that
if he says
language, there's that language like in Santa Monica and Beverly Hills and different places.
Beverly Hills doesn't have it.
Well, I mean, just say, but say, or Pasadena or wherever, Hollywood.
What language? I've never read that, but I believe if that's the case. But
You've read the case?
No, I'm sorry. I was responding to something Rachel said. That piece shouldn't hold these policy questions up. So we can work on that. I'll talk to Mr. Levin and hear his take from the assembly member who wrote the bill. I'm happy to listen and hear what he has to say, and we can talk about that in the, yeah.
I'm interested in knowing where everyone else is, because I heard our vice chair talk about the difference between having some concessions come to us versus some being approved at the director level. I've heard the vice chair's position on this, and I'm just kind of wondering where everyone else is on that. Because I don't know that anyone else weighed in on it. At least I didn't hear it.
I mean, I think you just said it. I mean, again, I'm not in favor of Section 2 as is written. I don't think it does what it intends to do, and I think I'd like to understand more about the legislative intent. I think that's where I'm what the city attorney said is, I think, is the correct next step if we were all in agreement about it.
So since we had no majority for any of those options, I'll try one more. So it sounds like, from what I heard, you'd like to move the additional story to in front of other regulatory concessions, and then we would end that sentence at the end of Government Code Section 65915 and strike that last sentence.
That's what I was saying, but I don't know if everybody agreed with that.
Could we get a straw poll?
Well, doesn't the state law say, instead of the applicant shall provide, that we may request?
Yes, but what I was saying is rather than holding up this topic with this ordinance, we can talk about it when we bring back other changes to 1922 in January.
Can we just move on into the next section?
And we'll continue
We
this
haven't decided what we're
conversation.
going to actually move
Recommend,
on.
yeah. So
So you're recommending that we move the height to a new item F before regulatory concessions and strike the last sentence of what's currently F?
Should the commission decide that that's what they'd like to do, I was looking for a straw poll. If you could raise your
I'm in
hands.
favor of that.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
So what are you, the rest of you, in favor of then?
Wait. The request to provide for the costs should include the additional story.
Right, so we would, that last subsection F would say, an additional story not to exceed 10 feet of total project height or other regulatory concessions that result in identifiable and actual cost reductions to provide for affordable housing costs or for rents for the affordable units as specified in Government Code Section 65915.
Good.
I'm in
So-
favor of that.
Could we get the hands at the
could
same
we
time?
raise our hands?
Okay, so it looks like that's five.
That's five.
for you?
Okay. All right.
Okay. Thank you. So moving on to section 3, this specifically calls out the review authority that requests for concessions under subsection F go to the Planning Commission, and that A through E would actually be based on the table. So it's not that requesting those other concessions would go to, would automatically be administratively approvable, but if it's, 3 units, for example, in R3, then it would fall into that administrative reviewable. If it was 10 units, it would fall under Planning Commission review. So we'd evaluate it the way we evaluate other projects. we
I
want to?
just think that the leap on the number of units is too much. That's
I
my-
disagree.
Can we stick to the review authority part first, though?
Yes.
Because then we can discuss that part next. I just want to separate them because they are so complexly interrelated.
So to clarify, what are you asking?
We're looking at section 3.
Okay.
And I am hoping we can just get a straw poll on a yes or no on this one, if that works, because it sounds like there wasn't any changes requested.
I'm okay with it as proposed.
As proposed?
Yes.
But we have to be okay with what's detailed in table 4.2 to be okay with that, and I'm not, so.
That's right. I can't say I agree with it because I'm not so sure I'm in favor of what's in table 4.
Okay, so yeah, we'll do the table
Items
first then.
3 and
Let's move on to
5 are-
section 5.
Items 3 and 5 are inextricably connected, so
Right.
to separate them into separate votes, I don't think is meaningful. I think we really have to look at them together.
Right, the key piece in section 3 is really that subsection F would be reviewed by the planning commission. We can
Right.
come back to that, though. Let's go on to the table, and we'll skip right to the end to section 5.
I have a comment on this. I disagree with the chair. I think for taking a big step back, and we talk about this all the time, and this gets very abstract, but we have a housing shortage in this region, period. And whatever whatever we can do to kind of help streamline the process in any way, I feel like is helpful. A and B, I have, and this isn't me just saying this for the sake of saying it, I have tremendous confidence in staff and in staff's abilities and everything they do, and you guys do a wonderful job. And the evidence of the fact that you guys do a wonderful job is that this is a great city, it's a wonderful city, and it's a very well planned city, and we won a lot of awards for that. Sorry. And I'm encouraged by the fact that the projects within a certain radius will still get noticed, will still have they'll still have the ability to comment at the staff level. So I am in favor of the table as proposed.
I think that's reasonable.
I echo the particularly the kind words of Commissioner Agai. I wish we could put more. Again, I said it earlier. We're dividing the track maps out from the development process. I wish we could send some of those track maps to staff. If it was within my power, I would support this. I would support this table as written. But because we can't, I support the table with the exception of dividing the track map out. I believe if they ask for a track map, that we have to see the development as well.
I'm
I
in
could
agreement with
support a small reduction in the number of units, like the chair said, but I like that it goes up drastically.
I just thought that what Mr. Levin said about the Levin was a good comment. Was a comment. I'd like to just make that one change, actually.
So change 13 to 11 in R4.
Yes.
12 to 11, right?
12 to 11.
So then it would.
13 to 11.
13 under.
13 to
so-
11.
Oh, I see.
And then 12 would turn into 10.
Right.
So today it's 8 or fewer, or 9 units for one inclusionary, and we'd be increasing that to 10.
Mm-hmm. That's my thought, but.
Wait, so I'm sorry. Could you say that again?
Yeah, so what I heard was the request to, first I heard a number of people that just liked it as is. But then it sounds like there is also a request to change the number, and perhaps we can break this up into little pieces here. Let's start with this. Can I get a straw poll on changing the thresholds for R4 zones from 12 or fewer as director review to 10 or fewer? Okay, but they're 5, okay. Okay, great. And so that would be 10 or fewer units in R4 in that first row, and in the second row, 13 would be changed to 11 as a result
I'm okay
of that.
with everything as you guys proposed it.
And then the other piece would be the
13 to 11.
the condo map piece. I heard Commissioner Bass state that he didn't want to split those up. It sounds like there is some support for that as well. Could I get a straw poll for for changing staff's recommendation to review it as is, so condos would always be before the Planning Commission, including the development permit? Okay, so that's a change. Okay, so overall, what Section 5 would say is we would strike 12 and change it to 10. We would strike 13 and change it to 11. And the residential condo section would remain as it is written today. So all of the new language proposed, track maps only, the underlying development project is reviewed based on the project characteristics. That would be struck from the recommendation. Can I get hands on all of that together? All right, thank you.
I would simply say that without the component of the enhanced noticing, to make sure that the public is thoroughly engaged, that I wouldn't support it as it stands. I mean, I am fine with the change of 10 to 11 conceptually, but I feel very strongly that the public noticing portion of this, it would be back to the transparency thing. If you really look at everything that's been through this commission in the past 6 months, I do believe this would, maybe 2 projects would have come to this body in the past 6 months under this schema.
Is your question about the noticing? Is your question about because what we just
voted
voted was to get rid of the notion that anything with a tract map would be able to be approved by staff?
Understood. But if someone does apartment building, then it would go to staff.
Only if it is a certain number of units.
If it's 10 units, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That would
right.
go to staff.
Which I understand. I'm just saying that as a component of that, I think it's really important that we notice the public more effectively than as are under the current guidelines. Rachel, I think you had that little arrowy thing, the 2 little arrows about what gets noticed and what doesn't. There you go. So that we do a much better job of noticing under staff review. And again, you know, I think this is a larger conversation about noticing, which I mentioned earlier. We talked about, you know, if it's a giant project that maybe we have a 1,000-foot radius or something like that. And if it's a smaller project, maybe we only have a 300-foot radius. But that making sure that that the public is adequately aware and not relying on a posting on a fence, I think is critical to making sure that they don't feel excluded from the public process.
We can certainly add a recommendation to take a look at the noticing, and that can be a kind of separate item that tracks differently than this as
Yeah.
well. Should the commission wish to make that recommendation.
I would be in favor of that.
That's not before considered.
That's not, I know it's not considered but at this time, but I think it's important.
Just going back to Section 3, we're not quite done, but we are getting there. Section 3 is the review authority section again, you know, based on what you said, moving 12 to 10, 13 to 11. Now we go back to subsection F would be automatically reviewed by the Planning Commission. As you have somewhat locked in thus far, subsection F would read the addition in height or any other. And then any other, you know, subsection A through E would be reviewed based on the threshold that we've discussed in the development permit review authority table. Could you take
that change? I'm in favor of that. I would move that.
3, 4. Okay.
You want to take comments
and
on
then-
the other 3?
What about the other 3 who did not vote for that? Is there something that you would like council to hear about that?
I'm okay with it. Make it 5.
Okay.
I feel like we should have reviewed these in like reverse order, because now I'm looking at this and I actually don't think that it's fine. I don't have any comments about it, but I'm not in favor of it as written.
Like what? Please?
Well,
Now's the time to speak
we
up.
put height in F.
Right.
I continue to be uncomfortable with telling developers, like, we're basically making some concessions. They're not all equal. And it seems to, I don't know. Again, I'm not a legal expert, but, you know, it seems to me that you can't, like, give some of them preference over others. I don't know.
Because
they're
F
not all
would have
equal,
to
you
come
know,
to commission and the others would not, is that what you're saying?
And I guess my question would be, if someone came to you asking for a 10% reduction in the rear and the front and the side, they're still all under staff review, so we're talking about a project that could be significantly varied, exceptioned, purely under staff review. And
It's 10 or less units in R4 or 6 or less units in R3. It's highly unlikely that projects that utilize the density bonus are actually that small. So that's kind of where I wanted to connect those dots as well, that, that threshold is still very low, and projects that get a 35% bonus in the number of units are typically higher than this, because projects that are 10 or smaller don't have to actually build affordable housing on site. They tend to pay fees in lieu instead and not take advantage of that. That's what we see. And in other communities that don't list height as a concession and it is rolled into the other, they don't get that the request the way that we do.
understood, but it's still what we're codifying here. And,
Right, absolutely.
and conceivably, someone could ask for all A through E concessions.
I don't think you can only get 3
Okay.
with a maximum amount of your affordable housing, and we also have very few requests of people who can achieve that.
But
Really,
the
it's
minute
one.
we start talking about exceptions, that's what planning commission's for. And so the more this is sort of piling on, if you will, the more I get uncomfortable.
Okay. So we had a
This is
5
just merely a
5 to 2.
recommendation.
Sure. Yeah. So we had a.
And council can do what they choose.
Well, didn't I hear we're going to see this resolution one more time?
Yes,
So,
yes.
since we polled on everything, can I be so forward as to make a motion that we hear?
We have one left, one left.
We have one left.
Do section 4. I
then
heard
I jumped the
section
gun.
3 is yes as written, based on 5 to 2. Section 4 is specifically related to that, does not result in identifiable and actual cost reduction, just mimicking state law language. Could we get a
I'm in favor of
show of
making
hands?
state law language.
And again, should we not move forward with this, this is something that could come back when we talk about the rest of the changes in reflection of state law. So I only saw 2 hands.
So to be clear, this is just to bring this part of our code into comportment with state law.
That's
That is
correct.
the only change.
That is the only change.
Okay,
5
so
to 6? It's like
If it's just,
all of the
basically.
hands. Okay.
So would a motion be in order just to,
Move everything that we just said along.
with our recommendations, to continue this item? To date
To
uncertain?
come back with a
Come back to us?
resolution.
To come back so
Come
that
back.
we can actually see
I'd
it
like
as
to
written.
request that you could make a motion based on, what we just kind of went through, and then we can come back to you with the resolution on consent, and then what you would do is ensure that it reflects the comments that are here. I mean, I respectfully to the commission, I would, oh my goodness.
Would
sorry,
the bring back be on
I
November
would-
30th?
So what I respectfully request is that, you guys have spent a lot of time going through this. I think we do have clear direction to make a motion, and then we would come back to you with a updated resolution, and you would basically approve on consent unless you don't feel like it meets the changes that you've requested.
Do you need me to spell all of that out in my motion?
Unless you want me to, it's up to you.
When do you
The-
anticipate
What are you saying
bringing
no
it back?
to, Lauren? I'm sorry.
That he doesn't need to spell it all out again in his motion.
So I
We
believe,
took the
I believe the
straw polls.
record reflects our direction, and so I will move that this come
I'll
back.
second the motion.
This come back with our direction.
Let's call the question.
And to be clear, that it would come back as 3 separate items.
No, this would all be one resolution reflecting all of the recommended changes that you've voted on.
Given what we
essentially.
just went
Are
through,
we
I
okay
would
with
highly
that
recommend
intent
breaking
issue?
apart.
I mean, is that resolved, or are you going to check that out more? Well, the whole idea. The legislative intent.
Into what we just discussed. The legislative intent for
it's going to become part of our resolution, right?
What
Be
is the
consistent
motion
with-
on the floor?
The motion on the floor is to
I thought we were
move.
talking about this language in January.
Yeah,
To
we
bring back the
we
resolution.
struck that language. So for section 1, we struck the director may, for section 1, I'm sorry, section 2, we struck the last sentence. So
Okay.
that will come back at a very different time with a more broad conversation about Government Code 65915.
Okay, then you can, I'm okay with that.
All right, so I think there's a motion on the
So
floor.
what is the
Motion is
motion?
going to incorporate all of the recommendations and changes that planning, that we've voted on, straw vote, right?
And if there's
Because there was
different votes on the
consensus on
diff-
each of the items.
Yes, but if you want us to report the different votes on each item in the staff report to council, we can also do that, because I know it was different for each piece of
Okay,
it.
that'd be
So
great.
That can also be reported to city council.
Okay.
When would you anticipate bringing this back?
November 30th.
That's good.
You're not going to be here.
I'm going to do this.
That was a lift.
And that motion passes unanimously, and we'll bring back the draft resolution for you on consent calendar.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to number 11, new business. There are, do you want me to, staff want to talk about that, John?
Here's the calendar.
The design review subcommittee meeting for the calendar year and the planning commission meeting, the calendar. Did people have an opportunity to see that? That we are going to, there's a recommendation that we cancel planning commission meetings for January 4th, 2018, December 6th, 2018, December 20th, 2018, and that we cancel the design review subcommittee meetings of November 22nd, 2018, and December 27th, 2018. That's to accommodate holidays and so forth. Is there any question about that? Do we need to vote on that?
I think so.
July 4th is a Wednesday. I'm just calling that out. Is there typically it's first and third of every month, so that would be July 5th? I'm just calling that out because I feel like a lot of
Perhaps
people
from a
will be out
public
of town.
process, that might be difficult because people that might want to come speak on an item may not be available in a way
Well,
that.
Usually
or
when-
would we even have a quorum is also a
Usually,
factor.
July 4th, that falls on a Wednesday, doesn't have holiday, it's just the day off usually. It doesn't have,
But
People are going to take off either a long weekend
It's
or a
either-
long early
or a
weekend.
long
They'll take a whole
in
week
clumps
off.
of days, yeah.
I think we should cancel the July 5th.
So is that a consensus of the commission to cancel July 5th?
so we'll add July 5th. Any other suggestions? Everybody okay with that?
I'll make a motion.
Can we have Saturdays back on November?
We're going to take a vote on that. Okay, it looks like the commission's been in favor of that. Going on to number 12, any unfinished business? There is none. Nothing on excluded consent calendar. Items from planning manager?
Nothing further this evening,
Tonight.
thanks.
And public comment. Do we have a speaker?
We have one, Edward Levin.
Thank you, Chair, Commissioners. I'll be brief. And I say this with all due respect to both staff and Commission, and I think that I've been here long enough that you all understand that I truly mean that. I would seriously recommend a study session on Government Code 65915. It's extraordinarily complex. I've been dealing with it since 2007. This is what I do for a living, or what passes for a living. It is very complicated, but there's a great deal of misunderstanding on the dais, understandably, because it is not what you all do for a living, by and large. And I think that it would help the discussion and also help you consider items like this if, if staff would be, if there could be a study session on, specifically on the government Government Code 65915, dealing with state density bonus.
Okay, thank you. Any items from commissioners at this point?
I have just one. Could we actually add that to the potential list of trainings? I know that we had done like a list of trainings about like legislative updates and stuff like that, just as something if we have time in a meeting to do. I think that would be helpful. I'd just like to be as informed as possible.
Okay.
I have one small administrative request. It's a little personal pet peeve of mine, page numbers. The Formosa project didn't have page numbers, and so when I dropped my package and I tried to put it back together, I had to go find the PDF, and it was very difficult. So identifying the documents, the green building pages never have the project name at the top, so you can't see, if you mix up your green building pages, you don't know from one project to the next, and that would be helpful for me.
Okay, thank you.
And you're talking about the plan sets provided by the developer?
No, actually, the staff report had no page numbers on Formosa, and when last meeting, the green building document that I was sent was just a PDF with a generic name on it as far as the file name, and the document itself could have been any building in the city because it had no words on it to identify by address what the project was. Thank you.
Good point. Commissioner Altschul?
I think the staff tonight showed the example as a total group and each one individually, how marvelous you guys are and what wonderful work you do. And of course, David included on that side of the room. We don't say this often enough,
Right.
you know, and I think every single one of you are miraculous, and we're very, very lucky. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you for making that comment, Commissioner Altschul. Any other comments? Then I'm going to adjourn the meeting of Planning Commission to the next meeting of November 30th, beginning at 6:30 p.m. here in West Hollywood Park Auditorium. Good night, everybody. Happy Thanksgiving.